prices soaring to the highest average ever recorded.
Highest inflation in 40 years.
Welcome to the third edition of the Future Leader Global Policy Forum, co-promoted and co-hosted by Bocconi University and by ISPI, and co-organized with OECD and T7 Japan. The forum will be now officially opened by an address by the rector and then the president of ISPI. Please.
Thank you very much. My name is Francesco Billari. I represent Bocconi University as the current rector, and I'd like to welcome all the guests, distinguished guests, authorities, students, future leaders, alumni to Bocconi. Bocconi is a university we are proud of, bridging Milan to Europe and the rest of the world, and the Global Policy Forum is a fantastic opportunity for us to host you. It is also a great honor to keep hosting this event. the Future Leaders Global Policy Forum. And I'd like to thank, in particular, the cooperation with Think 7 Japan, who helped us shaping the forum this year. Moreover, I'd like to thank the OECD for their support, and especially let me express the deepest Bocconi gratitude to our co-partner, ISPI, with whom we have worked and we will be working in the future. ISPI is a real driving force behind this initiative, and I'd like to thank you a lot. Welcome. I hope you have time to have a look at our campus. I'd like to characterize the Bocconi campus similarly to the Cathedral of the City of Milan. The Cathedral of the City of Milan was started about 7 centuries ago, and it's not yet finished. It will never be finished. The same is true for Bocconi campus. It's a bit younger, 120 Bocconi. This campus, a little bit younger than 120, but still young enough. But we are continuously working and trying to improve, also displaying a diversity of styles. So please have a look at our campus for those who are here in Milan. I'd like to thank all the speakers and participants who are here in Milan or virtually from all over the world, who will make this Future Leaders Global Policy Forum the house of constructive dialogue and exchange of ideas during these 2 days, which will be very intense. So thank you again, and it's my great pleasure to give the floor to Ambassador Giampiero Massolo, the President of ISPI. Have a nice couple of days and work well. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Giampiero Massolo. I'm the chairman of ISPI. You know, the lot of rectors and chairmen is to say hello and then to disappear. So I will try to be very brief. I also wish to make a warm thank you to Bocconi University. Our partnership is developing in a very nice, interesting, and fruitful, I hope, way. And this Global Policy Forum testifies exactly what I just said. OECD, thank you very much. You're our partners in this endeavor. And of course, also Think 7 Japan. While underlining Think 7 Japan's role, I would also like to say and to compliment that actually, this represents sort of an ideal continuity because the Japanese chair just accomplished the G7 nowadays, just over yesterday, and Italy will be holding its G7 next year. So it's an ideal continuity. Unfortunately, the conditions in which we all operate in the international community are not ideal. Actually, this is also because, and maybe it is one of the root causes for things getting as bad as we are witnessing, is that also multilateralism does not seem to ride high nowadays. It resembles very much, and increasingly so, a quest among governments, a quest among states. Of course, international organizations operate through the legs and walk with the legs of, with the brains and legs of their member states. But nevertheless, seldom in the past, the role of multilateralism has been so underappreciated. We really seem to have stopped to consider the multilateral tool as a useful tool to solve global crises. And this is maybe why we have global challenges, but global answers are lacking. So why we are not provocative? We should be a little bit more provocative. And the best way of being provocative is to betting on young leaders, betting on future leaders, betting on on young people. And so I would stimulate you to think out of the box, to try to envisage, to try to create something that I would call multilateralism bottom-up. Since top-down is not feeling well, maybe bottom-up we could stimulate a sort of refreshing therapy to multilateralism. And once again, we have to leave it to local communities, we have to leave it to ONGs increasingly, we have to leave it to local governments, to regions, to towns, and to the young people. You are our hope. I hope that in those days, this interrelation that you will be able to have with more experienced people will be fruitful, provocative, and maybe bring the multilateralism to be key for the international relations system back again. This is my hope, and I'll leave it with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We said that this 2023 forum will be mainly focused on future leaders, and there is no better way to start the forum than calling on stage two future leaders, one from the business community and one from the think tank community. Marianne Chisset, future think tank leader, head of research and project at the West Africa think tank Wadi, welcome. And Leven Tuzum, future business leader, principal economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD. Mariam, you have the floor.
Thanks, and good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start to thanking ISPI and its partner for organizing this event and allowing us to be part of it. I would like to share some views about what are the challenges we face globally actually in the world. The 2 last years have ended with a backdrop of complex and unpredictable global developments, and even if these 2023 years were seen as hopeful, the difficulties and challenges are still very present. These challenges concern many important sectors, such as peace and stability, economy, energy, and food, which are deeply affected. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine remains one of the biggest concerns in the world. This conflict has caused a disruption of global supply chain, driving up energy and food prices, increasing inflation, and posing risk of recession in many economies. Unfortunately, Ukraine is not the only theater of conflicts of concern in 2023. Many other crises require our attention, most of them stemming from conflict, but also from climate shocks. Armed violence and insecurity in the Sahel have increased. Education, health, water, and sanitation services, which were already weak, are further disrupted. Thousands and thousands of schools in Sahel have been closed. The Horn of Africa also is feeling the full impact of the climate crisis. The region is now in a critical situation. It has experienced 5 consecutive episodes of drought, and it will result in continuing the catastrophe for the people, with at least 36 million people requiring emergency assistance to survive, including 26 million people facing severe food insecurity. And the current demographic dynamics also present challenges that we must reflect on. In particular, the aging of populations in Europe and its socio-economic consequences, as well as the need for the African countries to offer to their ever-growing youth education, training, health, and employment and development opportunities. Population growth also raises another challenge, that of better resource management to ensure sustainable development for the entire planet. And all of the above will impact on migration patterns and regional political stability while increasing competition for scarce resources. Another challenge awaits the world also, increased geostrategic competition among the major powers, particularly in terms of economics, trade, and technology. And even if this competition is considered to be under control and unlikely to lead to crises, it may still have some impact on investment flows, global trade, and even the structure of international relations. And for all of these issues, all these challenges, It is more urgent than ever to reinforce international cooperation, regional and global connection models. Multilateral institutions, too, must reinforce and increase their role, contributing effectively to the process of crisis management and global socio-economic development. Research institutions also have a fundamental role to play. They must continue to conduct in-depth research which will document each of the issues and challenges, thus serve as a basis for better, more effective and efficient policy decisions. Through the many innovative projects we are implementing, we young researchers from universities, research centers, and think tanks will be able to continue to process concrete solutions to address these challenges and in a much more inclusive way. Thank you for your attention.
Dear guests and attendees of the Global Policy Forum, let me start with a thank you. Thank you, ISPI, for inviting me to share some thoughts on the future of business in the next decade and beyond, but also for your generous interpretation of youth and the future. You see, I'm part of the golden generation that managed to graduate into the financial crisis. Statistics show that our income prospects are doomed. But oh well. Here's the more interesting bit. 10 years ago, there was a very abrupt shift away from banking and consulting towards technology and entrepreneurship in terms of career choices for top young graduates around the world. That's how recent it is, and yet we take it as granted. What's remarkable about the past decade is how much the larger culture and spirit of entrepreneurship have taken root around the world. Now, was it all a fad, a consequence of the low interest rate and high liquidity era? Is the party over? Let's talk about the headwinds. Larry Summers and Olivier Blanchard recently had a public debate on real interest rates. Summers thinks they will increase and remain elevated, while Blanchard believes that the forces behind secular stagnation remain at play. I think we agree that liquidity will not be as abundant as it was in the past decade. At the core of this debate, though, is the long-term dynamic between savings and investment, including demographics and the effect on our financial future. And today, despite all these headwinds, I'm arguing that entrepreneurship, not just tech-oriented, but of all kinds, will survive and thrive even if interest rates remain elevated. Now, I can almost guarantee you that no prospective business founder finally weighs global macro forces before venturing out, unless they're a new, brave macro hedge fund manager. But they do perhaps look at trends, dislocations, and other forms of opportunity around them. Remember, only half of the G20 countries are among the 20 most populous ones in the world. None are among the fastest growing populations. And there's plenty of wealth creation and distribution yet to be done in much of the world. So how will a risk-loving future business leader think about where to deploy his or her time, effort, and talent? An obvious answer to me is the Global South, and in particular, South-South trade and business. The resilience of the entrepreneurial spirit extends to the Global South and benefits from the inbuilt forces of wider access to knowledge and cross-border investments of long-term capital. To be clear, business opportunities and successes in and among the Global South will not be limited to technology. In fact, one challenge and opportunity lies with infrastructure and logistics capabilities between Global South countries. I quizzed ChatGPT about its dream South-South project, and it first listed a high-speed rail system before flipping to a regional fiber optic network. Now, while large projects may not be the typical domains of entrepreneurship, they do require the same strong spirit to complete, and they do create long and deep value chains with new opportunities. To come back to human business activity for a second, successful future business leaders will need to acquire new skills and sensibilities, specifically to navigate complex and diverse needs, aspirations, and commercial practices of different countries, all the while remaining true to and mindful of the two crucial global themes of our time, inclusion and sustainability. The elephant in the room, I know you're thinking, is the US and China. Despite the conventional wisdom, I don't see this rivalry as a net headwind for creative entrepreneurs out of the global south. Let me leave you with one concrete proposal: to make better use of Mediterranean assets, geographic, economic, technical, social, and cultural. The Mediterranean shores are home to large parts of the global north and south, and they comprise fertile ground for cooperation, competition, and success. I have full faith in future business leaders to weave new threads in and out of this region for a more vibrant and prosperous world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. Thank you, Levent. You will hear a lot about the Global South, a lot on US and China in this two-day forum, but we now move east. Last year, we opened our forum with Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, a country which is still torn by a devastating war whose effects are deeply felt well beyond Ukraine borders, but inevitably even more so in countries which are just at the borders, starting from Moldova. Just like Ukraine, Moldova has found itself under Moscow influence for long. And just like Ukraine, Moldova has been de facto stripped of part of its territory, Transnistria, where Russia established a military presence over 30 years ago. Today, we have the honor to hear more about Moldova directly from its president. Let me introduce the President of the Republic of Moldova, Her Excellency Maia Sandu.
Dear future leaders, it's my pleasure to address this distinguished gathering at the Global Policy Forum 2023. I would like to share with you the recent journey of Moldova's young and vibrant democracy, its aspirations for EU membership, the challenges we face in the wake of Russia's war against Ukraine, and the role of young people in helping to tackle them. We are all going through unprecedented challenges these days, where a war against a sovereign country is again ravaging the European continent. Russia's ruthless invasion of Ukraine has changed the way we view our present and our future, as individuals, as countries, and as a community of democracies who thought until recently that the rules-based international order is unshakable. We are at a critical juncture where we need to redefine our security, our energy security on the continent, but also in the world. At a critical juncture where we need to defend our democratic values that we often take for granted. Moldova is doing its part. By maintaining stability in Moldova, we contribute to stability in Europe. We are contributing to the pan-European efforts to help refugees. We are contributing to the solidarity lanes, to peacekeeping missions, to fighting corruption, money laundering, cross-border organized crime. Better international rankings reflect our efforts and political will to strengthen our democracy. In the Press Freedom Index, published by Reporters Without Borders, Moldova has climbed 61 positions, from 89th to 28th out of 180 countries in 2 years alone. On the Rule of Law Index of the World Justice Project, we have advanced by 14 positions since 2020. On corruption perception, measured by Transparency International, we have advanced by 24 positions in the last 2 years. Our society and our citizens are committed to democracy, and Moldova's best way to thrive as a democracy is to be part of the European Union. Only yesterday, Moldovans have gathered to show the world that we are fully committed to our European future. By seeking EU membership, we commit to greater regional cooperation, stability and prosperity, benefiting not only Moldova, but also its neighboring countries and the EU. In Moldova, young people are the driving force behind the nation's aspirations for EU membership. Through their active engagement, young Moldovans are shaping policies, influencing decision-making processes, and advocating for the necessary reforms. The youth of Moldova have shown remarkable resilience, courage, and determination in shaping the democratic landscape of Moldova. From my personal experience, I worked together with many young people to build the Action and Solidarity Party, a party that we established from scratch, based fully on voluntary work, conducted for several years until we managed to take down from power a corrupt oligarchic regime which captured the state. Some of these young people are now members of the parliament, some joined the government, some young people returned from abroad. We're working shoulder to shoulder to transform our country. Moldova's vibrant democracy owes much to the active participation of young people who have breathed life into its institutions and inspired hope for a better future. However, as Moldova strives to consolidate its democracy and pursue EU membership, it faces significant challenges arising from the consequences of Russia's war against Ukraine. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine has had a profound impact on the region, with Moldova being no exception. In facing these challenges, Moldova relies on the support and solidarity of the international community. Together, we can work towards a future where nations can coexist in peace, prosperity, and respect for each other's sovereignty. Our commitment to Europe, to peace, will be on display when Moldova hosts the second summit of the European Political Community on June 1st. The EPC provides an opportunity to discuss shared solutions to the shared challenges that we face. We will be discussing peace and security, energy resilience, climate action, and how to enhance interconnections on the continent. We will stand together, recognizing that a strong and prosperous European political community serves not only our citizens, but also contributes to the stability and progress of the entire continent. Thank you.
Thank you, President Sandu. For many of us, I don't see President Sandu anymore. Oh, President Sandu, for many of us, you are part of the family. You are part of our family because we have so many Moldovan ladies and men working for us, helping us in our daily life, and most of them, as you know, voted for you, the diaspora. And so we follow from far away from Italy what you do, your challenge, the challenge of your country. What can Italy, what can Europe do more to help your country in the short run? You mentioned EU membership, but what can we do more to help you in the near future?
We are very grateful for the support. Moldova is also facing attempts by Russia to destabilize our country. Moldova is facing significant economic challenges as well because of the consequences of the war. And we have been receiving support from our friends from the international community when we were dealing with a very bad energy crisis, when we had to deal with the refugee crisis, and now with the economic crisis. So the most important thing is to support our EU aspirations and our will to protect and consolidate our democracy. Unfortunately, this regional situation, and especially what Russia is doing today in Ukraine, represents a threat to all the countries in the region, but especially to a small country like Moldova, a country with a still fragile democracy, which we want to consolidate. And we want to know that we can rely on the democratic world, and the democratic world will help us consolidate our democracy. But also, we are working hard to strengthen our economy, and we're interested in attracting investments in Moldova so that we could create economic opportunities. One thing that we have learned since independence is that consolidation of democracy goes hand in hand with economic development.
Thank you, President. You have kindly accepted to take a couple of questions from our future leader. So, Mariam, you have the floor.
My question is, over the past year and more, you have done a lot to host Ukrainian refugees. And how are Moldovan citizens dealing with these refugees? And do you think that Moldova's support for hosting them might be diminishing as time goes by?
I'm actually very proud that Moldovans have been able to help so many refugees. We have seen hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian refugees crossing our border. This winter, we had 100,000 Ukrainian refugees in Moldova, which is close to 4% of the population. Today, we still provide shelter to 80,000 people. And the most recent polls show that Moldovans are ready to host even more refugees if this would be needed. As I said, from the very first day of the war, Moldovans opened their houses and their hearts and have been helping, together with the state institutions, everyone who sought this support. And this is our duty. We do feel safer today thanks to the courage of the Ukrainian people who defend their land and their nation, but they also defend Moldova and the rest of the continent.
Okay, Levent, you have the floor for your second question.
Madam President, thank you for your remarks. Last June, the European Council granted Moldova the status of a candidate country. That seems like good progress. How fast do you expect the accession process to go forward? And if progress is slow, do you fear that there may be some disillusionment?
Well, Moldova has been on this path, has been planning to become a EU member state for a long time. Of course, the decision of the European Council last year to grant our country the candidate status has increased our efforts and improved our hopes. We do understand that this is a complex process. We do have a lot of challenges that we need to tackle. We are working very hard on reforming justice, on strengthening the independence of the anti-corruption institutions. So we have a full agenda, but our plan is to be fully ready for accession by the end of this decade, which means by 2030. And we are going to work very hard for that. There is political will, there is popular support. We had a big meeting of the citizens this Sunday, yesterday, and we saw many people coming into the streets and supporting the EU path of Moldova. And this is confirmed also by the opinion polls. We also have very good relations. We saw the openness of the EU member states, and will continue to work to make our dream real.
Thank you, President Sandu. All best wishes for your work as President of the Republic and for your country. Thank you very much for having been with us today. Thank you very much. Join me with a round of applause for the President of Moldova. And now, thank you also, our two future leaders. We now have a little change of program. We are anticipating the next section on Ukraine.
Peace in Ukraine. Mission impossible. Is Russia turning into a pariah state? Is China a responsible mediator? Just a European war in the eyes of the global South?
Charles Kupchan, thank you for being with us. Charles Kupchan is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and professor of international affairs at Georgetown University. You have served on the staff of the National Security Council with Bill Clinton and then the Barack Obama administration. And from 2014 to 2017, you have been special assistant to the president and senior director for European affairs. Over the past year, Charles has been following closely the development in the Ukraine and the West's response to the invasion. And it's a real pleasure and an honor to have you here with us and to have your keynote address now, and then you will be participating in a panel with other esteemed colleagues. Charles, last February, you tweeted that the US and the West should prepare for a diplomatic endgame in Ukraine. Is a just peace for all the actors involved achievable? And in that case, what should it look like?
Thank you, Paolo. It's a pleasure to be here and to join the Future Leaders Conference. You know, if you and I had had this conversation last May instead of this May, I think none of us would have predicted that the war would have gone as well as it has from the perspective of Ukraine and from the perspective of the West. And Ukraine has put up a remarkable defense against Russian aggression, and the United States and Europe have stayed in lockstep in ways that I would not have predicted, and our publics have continued to support more aid, economic and military, to Ukraine. And just over the last weekend at the G7, a decision was made to start training Ukrainian pilots on F-16s. So far, so good. You may then ask, well, then why talk about an endgame? And let me share with you how I see the conflict going forward. I think we should do whatever we can now to help Ukraine make a success of its coming offensive, to take back as much land as possible in the coming months. That having been said, I don't believe that Ukraine, over the course of this year, will succeed in taking back every inch of its territory, which is what we hope for, which is what Zelensky says he aims to do. But I do think we have to be realistic, and we have to make a plan B for the contingency that at the end of this offensive, some chunk of Ukrainian territory, probably Crimea, maybe some of Donbass, will not be under Ukrainian control. And as a consequence, I think we need to have a quiet conversation within NATO, with Ukraine, about what happens when we get to that point. And I don't think the answer is, well, more of the same. And I think that we need to have a realistic look at the costs of this war and weigh those costs against the argument that we need to stay the course for as long as it takes. And there are 4 issues that motivate my thinking about why we need to think about an end game. 1, this is a war that's destroying Ukraine. And I think you could argue that it's better to have a Ukraine in possession of, let's say, 89% of its territory. They now have about 85, 86. Maybe they'll get 93, maybe they'll get 94. But a Ukraine that is rebuilding for the future, rather than a Ukraine that could potentially turn into a failed state because it fights for the next several years. 2, this is a war that could escalate. We've seen missiles fall on Polish territory, NATO. We've seen Russian aircraft force down a US drone. We saw a few weeks ago a couple of drones explode over the Kremlin. This is a war that has the potential to turn into World War III. As a consequence, we need to bring it to an end sooner rather than later. 3, this is a war that is polarizing the international system. The US, its allies in Asia and Europe on one side, Russia and China on the other side, 2 blocks, most of the rest of the world not taking sides. India, Brazil, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, even major democracies are saying, we don't want to get caught in a new era of East-West rivalry. This is a dangerous moment because, as some of the speakers already said, we need multilateralism. We need great power cooperation to tackle climate change, to tackle the management of AI. Finally, I do worry about us. To put it in different terms, the threat posed by illiberal populism in the West is, in my mind, at least as potent a threat as that posed by Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping.
But on this point, you said, I'm worried by us. I thought you were going to say by the US. But let me ask you specifically on the US, because in the us, we have the US election next year. And there are rising concern that a Republican, whoever, at the White House would make a difference. How do you assess that scenario? On the war, I mean.
Well, I do think that us has to be defined as the collective West, both sides of the Atlantic, because I don't think that either of us is out of the woods. That is to say that our political centers have weakened. In Italy, in France, in the US, there are individuals with illiberal tendencies. I have to say, in my own country, I find it somewhat unrecognizable what's happened to our politics. Now, I don't think it will take the new election to potentially change American policy in Ukraine. Look at public opinion going somewhat soft. Look at the fact that the House of Representatives is now controlled by Republicans, and the Republican Party is deeply split between hawks and an America First wing. It's not at all clear to me that when Biden goes and says, I need another $30 billion to support Ukraine, Congress is going to say, here's the check. Now, as a consequence, I do think that Biden is better off heading into this election with the war either over or on the way down, because if it's full force, more money, more weapons, I think Trump and his wing of the party are going to use it for electoral purposes. I'm still confident that Biden will be reelected, but I do think that we have to keep a very close eye on getting our political systems back up on their feet and making sure that liberal democracy is solid going forward. We don't want to see Ukraine win and wake up the next morning and see our own liberal democracies eroding from inside.
Thank you, Charles. You have kindly agreed to stay for the panel, and so let me invite the panelists for the session on Ukraine to reach us on the floor, and we will immediately start the session. Let's welcome our panelists with a round of applause. Thomas, you can sit here. Thomas Gomart, Director of IFRI, Andrei Kolesnikov, Senior Fellow and Chair at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, welcome. Aliona Jetmachuk, Founder and Director of the New Europe Center in Kiev, and last but not the least, Luanda Mgoze, Future Think Tank Leader for the South African Institute of International Affairs. You are all welcome to our meeting. Some of you are old friends, some are new faces in this meeting, but you are both very welcome. Thomas, in a recent paper, you highlight the return of geopolitical blocs. As the Ukraine war is increasingly presented by Russia and the West as an existential threat, are we moving even faster towards competing blocs?
First of all, Paolo, thank you for your invitation and thank you for organizing this great meeting. I don't remember having written something so stupid.
I proofs.
So you have to refer. Now, the thing is, I think I was trying to explain the evolution of the geopolitics of energy when I say about new blocks. I will start with that because I do think that one of the main consequences of the war in Ukraine is the energy rupture between Europe and Russia, which was something very well established in the beginning of the 80s. And I observed that since more than 1 year, there is a tendency which is, in fact, that energy security has become a top priority everywhere in the world. And that we observe a sort of convergence, energy convergence, between Russia, China, Iran, and is it a bloc? Is it an energy bloc? It's an open question. And I observe also, a shift coming from Saudi Arabia in this regard. Saudi Arabia is more and more independent in its energy policy and does want to solidify the OPEC plus agreements between Saudi Arabia and Russia. And on the other side, if you observe, the compensation of the Russian and oil gas, there are part of that which is coming from Gulf countries, but it's quite limited. Part of that which is coming from Algeria, which is also limited, but namely it's coming from Norway, the UK, and the US. So that's why, I had this perspective of sort of energy blocks. So now, to go to your more political question, I think that we face a situation in which, in fact, there is much more transatlantic unity to support Ukraine against the Russian aggression. And there is also this feeling that Russia is supported by China. And there is also another group, a large group of countries, which do blame Russia, but which decided not to sanction Russia. And some of them are coming from what you call the global south, which is for me the transactional south, but also countries like India. So that's why, in fact, this war is very important because it's creating such sort of groupings, but I won't use, the wording of blocks.
Would you agree, Thomas, with the point which Charles just made on the need to work on an end game while supporting Ukraine? And he mentioned 4 reasons to do that.
Sorry?
Would you agree on the point Charles just made on the need to have an end game, to actively work on an end game on Ukraine war?
Of course. The question is, the decision taken by the Ukrainian leadership. Once again, that's the starter. Ukraine is fighting. It's an existential fight, and I think that Aliona will be back on that directly. So it is for sure the Ukrainian decision, and I belong to those who think that Ukraine should be supported until its decision.
Yeah, I would immediately turn to you, Aliona, because on the point Thomas just raised, we all know that Ukraine should not give to Russian to not accept Russian blackmail. We know that a just and fair endgame is needed, but we all know that this is not necessarily feasible. Where do you think the line should be drawn in exchange for peace? I mean, this is something we keep asking to everyone coming from Ukraine. Your president was in Italy a week ago, and he had 7 altogether, director of newspaper and TV program, asking the same question, which is the one I'm posing to you right now.
Thank you, Paolo. It's good to be back to Milan, even for one day. First of all, I would like, we hope that regaining all territories is still feasible. As we love saying in Ukraine, the goal defines mean. So if the goal is to achieve lasting peace, not just another fragile ceasefire, there will definitely be means for that. But, you know, if the goal is to have another ceasefire just and frozen conflict and Minsk III deal, of course, this task would be more complicated for us. But anyway, I believe that it's still doable. And as you know, and as Italians people know, no one and no country in the world is more interested in peace than Ukraine is. So because it's our people are dying, it's our children are kidnapped and forcefully deported to Russia, the Russian Federation, and we are under missile strikes and drone strikes almost on daily basis, and I came to Kiev, so I know what I'm talking about. But the point is that we are interested in this lasting, you know, just peace, not another ceasefire. And the ceasefire, as we experienced since 2015, and it basically led to this large-scale invasion, let's be honest. So, and if someone would try to sell Ukraine another ceasefire, another Minsk deal as the end of the war, or even as Ukraine's victory, it would not work. Because Ukraine is a democracy, and Thomas mentioned that Ukrainian leadership would decide. I would say that even that Ukrainian society and Ukraine society would decide on behalf of Ukraine, because we are a democracy, and in Ukrainian society now we have 72% of people who are against any concessions. So I think that basically Ukrainian society reached a point of no return in terms of any concessions. And the more aggressive Putin is, the more evidence of executed civilians, of mass graves, of you know, any of all war crimes committed by Russia, the less space for any concessions and for any compromises remains, unfortunately. There was a chance, and Ukraine was very serious about negotiating peace last year. There was a diplomatic offer in March last year. There was President Zelensky 10 points peace plan released at the G20 summit, and his call to conduct a global peace summit. But unfortunately, we don't see any indications that Russian leadership is serious about any negotiations. We don't see any indication. Yes, there are some calls sometimes, and usually when they start losing on battlefields, they start calling for negotiations or talking about talks. But in fact, you know, by those calls, they're pursuing two goals now. The first goal is, from our perspective, the first goal is to destroy Ukraine's counteroffensive, and the second goal is to discredit Ukraine globally as a country which doesn't want to negotiate. But we want to negotiate. We want negotiated peace, but we are striving for sustainable peace, lasting peace.
Aliona, can I ask Charles to make a comment on your comments? Charles, please.
I support the same end if it's possible to achieve it. I would like to see Ukraine in possession of every inch of its territory. I think we have to prepare for the possibility that that may not be where this conflict ends up anytime soon, and then we have to ask, then what? I also think it's important not to presume that if Ukraine expels Russia, then Russia will behave, and if Ukraine is left in possession of 6% of Ukrainian territory, then they're just going to do this again. They will do this again as long as Putin or somebody like Putin is around. And as a consequence, we need to have a long-term plan to prepare Ukraine to defend itself for the future, because it lives in a dangerous neighborhood, however this war ends.
And supplying F-16 moves in that direction, supporting Ukraine for a long-term resistance, more than just winning right now. Thank you, Charles. Andrei, let's move a little bit to Russia, because can you confirm that in February you wrote an article whose title was, whose title was "Russians Learn to Stop Worrying and Love the War"? Can you confirm that?
Yes.
Yes, if so, apparently from your article, it's not only Putin's war. What is today's approach of Russia to the war? Has it changed?
Yes, you know, it was a title of my editor in Foreign Affairs, so, because it is too provocative, but the part of the truth is in it. I recently read an article with the old Italian anecdote, in a sense joke, not historical anecdote, about Mussolini, when during the breakfast one of the sons of Mussolini asked him, "Father, what does it mean, fascism?" And Mussolini, being furious, says, "Eat up and shut up." And this formula, this is quite exact description of the authoritarian way of the behavior of the society. But the problem is that we crossed this line of the authoritarian regime. The problem is that since maybe September 2022, when there was a partial mobilization in Russia, Putin violated old social contract with the society. Do not intervene in our affairs, in our corruption, in everything. We will not intervene into your private life, which is kind of more or less normal in terms of market economy. But from September, from October, he asked the population to share their voices, their corpse, their bodies. You have to share the responsibility, guys, he said to the society, and go to the war, go to the trenches. This is absolutely another situation. The level of anxiety was very high at that very time. There were some protests, but the society, generally speaking, the majority of the society survived this threat. And now war is routinized, but again, there are two myths about Russian society. Nobody supports in reality war because people simply, they hide their views. Another point of view is all Russians, they all support this war. This is also not true. Generally speaking, we have, if we'll even take the famous figure 70% of support according to the data of independent Levada Center, this is simply a general figure because inside this figure there are a lot of different contradictory feelings. I mean, around 15 maybe percent, according to my colleague sociologists, these people are active conformists, active supporters of the war, very cruel in their behavior, in their vision, etc., etc. Other part of this support, this is kind of men in the middle who will support everything which is coming from the top because these people, they don't have their own opinion, just like nearly in any society. And on the other flank, we see active non-conformists, or like passive non-conformists, which were always 15–20%, which were always against Putin, against his initiatives. They were pro-liberal, pro-Western, pro-democratic. And here is the divisions in this society.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Luanda, someone mentioned, Charles, I think, mentioned that when we look at Africa and other parts of the world, condemning Russia and supporting Ukraine is not shared by everybody. There are different views. Has that to do with effective Russia propaganda, or do you see any other explanation for this different view?
Thank you. Thank you very much, first of all, for having me as a new face. I'm delighted to be here. I think it's important that we're able to speak about this as Africans in platforms that have dynamic groups of people and people from different regions, so that we're not speaking amongst ourselves. I think certainly this one requires a lot of nuance. You know, the first resolution, ES-11/1, to condemn Russia at the UN really was the beginning of a very interesting time in foreign affairs and how Africa is viewed in relation to the war. 22 countries voted in favor of the resolution. 1 country voted against it, with 17 countries abstaining and several other countries not being in the room during the vote. In favor were countries such as Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, Zambia, Egypt. Against was Eritrea. And countries that abstained are South Africa, Uganda, Tanzania, Angola, Mozambique. So it shows you that there's really a perceived division in how Africa voted. It demonstrates at least a perception that the region is not voting in coalesce. However, we really do need to look at the statements and the positions to really get to understand quite significantly where Africa stands in the matter. There's an important convergence from the African region in calling for peace and a peaceful solution. Although all these countries voted differently, South Africa and Kenya stand together in their call for a peaceful solution and a diplomatic solution in the war. Rwanda said solution can only be achieved through dialogue by the parties. Namibia promotes peace, respect for international law, settling disputes through peaceful means. When reading the statements from countries in the West, there is no advancement of peace and peaceful solutions. And that is what we desperately need at this point to end the war. So attributing Africa's response to Russian propaganda, I'm afraid, kind of strips away Africa's agency, because you cannot deny that this war is happening against the backdrop of geopolitical tensions and a very, very tense global landscape. So this is where Africa becomes the theater of geopolitical contestation, and countries have to look after their interest first before responding in any particular manner and not trying to go back to the Cold War era. So I think there's a lot of agency there, and there's a lot of nuance there that we really, really need to study before we analyze Africa's response.
Thank you, Luanda. Thank you. We have a second round of questions, shorter than the previous one, because we have to move then to the next session. Let me start again from Thomas. We, the European Union, have provided relevant military and economic support to Ukraine, much more than we thought, much less than the US. And President Macron keeps insisting on the European strategic autonomy, but is Europe getting out of the war more or less autonomous from the US, from your standpoint?
You know, to comment on President Macron's statement is a big challenge for me. Yeah, as you know, he was said to be the chief tanker, the think tanker in chief, by Politico. So I don't want to comment on that. But your question is very important. A way to rephrase it is to ask what would have been the U.S. position with Donald Trump in the White House, and that's this question for after 2024. So for sure, I think that if the US won't have supported so significantly Ukraine, I'm afraid of saying that Europeans certainly would have, sent tents, and that would have been all. So the question now of strategic autonomy, there is huge step which was made by Europeans in security and defense matter in their mindset, I would say, with this war at the core of Europe. Because Europe lost its main competitive advantage at the global level, which was its strategic stability. It's over, and I think it's over, unfortunately, for 1, 2, maybe 3 decades. So the question for Europeans is, of course, there is now this transatlantic unity, which is highly important to support Ukraine, as I said initially. But what will be the European attitude if Donald Trump, or another one, this type of profile, would be elected? And it's a question not only regarding Ukraine and Russia, it's a question for Europeans how Europe is able to stabilize its neighborhood by itself, in the links with NATO if needed, but also with maybe another US behavior in the coming decade. And that's something very difficult to be anticipated, and that's why I think that Europeans should be prepared to act within NATO and within the EU, but maybe with a less important US involvement.
Thank you, Thomas. Andrei, many Russians decided to flee abroad. You choose to stay in Moscow despite opposing the war in public. Can we take that as a positive signal, meaning that you believe that civil society can promote change in Russia?
My staying in Moscow, this is not positive signal, rather negative. This is simply a personal decision which could be changed. In the case of emergency, not to mention that I'm a foreign agent, officially foreign agent in Russia. This is a special legal status, and the history of Russia could be measured by different personal family stories. For instance, my mother was the daughter of enemy of people, and she's, in that sense, mother of a foreign agent, nearly the same. But, civil society still exists. Yes, we can see these people in the streets, but we must understand that we live in the circumstances where police and military suppression inside Russia is higher than in Soviet times, at least at Brezhnev era, not to mention Gorbachev era. Civil society is ready to suggest kind of changes. Diaspora is ready. Diaspora is extremely important because the majority of media relocated to the West, and they are very important to the audience inside Russia, which needs information, alternative opinions, and compassion. But we can distinguish these elements of the civil society using simply criminal statistics. Nearly 20,000 detentions for anti-war position. More than 500 criminal cases against people with anti-war position, 6,500 cases on the administrative basis for the so-called discreditation of the army, extrajudicial prosecution, nearly 800 media resources blocked or closed in Russia, fired professors, fired teachers, purges in universities, purges among lawyers who are defending dissidents. This is civil society. Yes, they crushed the organizational basis of the civil society, not to mention opposition. But it resists. It is ready to suggest some plans for the future. It is ready to think about collective responsibility and guilt at the end of the day. But in this situation, for sure, the society needs some help from the very top. Elites are for Putin. They simply serve him, even in a case if they express somewhere in secret places discontent with Putin as well. But unfortunately, during the Putin's period, we will not have any kind of serious changes, and they must come from the top, just like it was always in the history of Russia after death of Stalin and death of Kremlin's gerontocrats.
Thank you, Andrea. I'm afraid we are running out of time, but I do want to conclude with Aliona and you. Aliona, Charles mentioned that he is worried by us, meaning the fatigue in Western society. Aren't you worried as well a little bit that our strong support may at a point diminish and some, I mean, you have an incredible president who is an incredible ambassador of your struggle, of your drama, but never in recent history a crisis has been dominating for months or years, if that could continue. Are you contemplating that fatigue?
Thank you for this question. Yes, of course, we are worried, but still we see quite strong support, quite a high level of solidarity, especially in Europe, in the US, and our think tank just commissioned an opinion poll in 5 countries, the US, Germany, Italy, France, the Netherlands, and Germany, which showed that on some issues, public is even more decisive and more supportive than decision makers and governments of those countries. I'm not talking about Italy. In Italy, we have different picture, but on some other countries, for example, on issues like NATO, Ukraine's NATO membership, public is much more supportive, and majority of people who express their opinion already support formal invitation to Ukraine to NATO already in Vilnius NATO summit. What can Ukraine do here? Of course, we can conduct successful counteroffensive and demonstrate in this way that all of the investments are paid back. We can continue reforms because we want to win not only the war, but we want to win the peace, as our American partners are saying. That's why we are conducting reforms, and we are successfully implementing 7 recommendations European Union provided to us together with candidate status. And this year we are expecting for political decision of opening accession talks. But we also can't, we have to also debunk Russian propaganda narratives worldwide. And here we ask for your support, think tank and opinion leaders support, because we cannot do it like without your help and without your support here. And then you all will be invited to big Sevastopol victory party, of course.
And we will surely come. Luanda, you have the last comment. You know, we have been repeating many times in the last months that the loser of this new tension is multilateralism and global institutions. And the winner are like-minded grouping, like the G7. Someone says also BRICS, but do you think BRICS is really a like-minded group?
I absolutely do think it's a like-minded group. It's a convergence of countries with different ideologies, regimes, and they function differently, and the economies are not the same. But what is very common is the strong support for multilateralism. It's the recognition that the global architecture we live in has winners and losers, where big powers sometimes get to do as they please, even though we do live in a rules-based international order. So BRICS, you'll see them, strongly cooperating in areas where they want to strengthen multilateralism, where they want to strengthen local currencies, where there is a support for the rules in which we live under to a larger extent. And we have seen an interest from other countries wanting to join the BRICS since the 2013 outreach initiative by South Africa, and then subsequently by the Chinese BRICS Plus initiative. And there has been a very strong push from the Chinese for a formal expansion, which has not been received well by the other members. But with the current geopolitical landscape as it is, I do think it's receiving considerable attention, and we can anticipate probably an expansion. So that's the importance of groupings and blocks.
Thank you. I was moving close because I have my colleague saying end, we have to finish. And so I was moving towards you to give the impression that the end is coming. The end of the session. Please join me with a great round of applause. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We were worried we had lost Alexandra Romantsova. We couldn't find her, but she's here. Welcome, welcome, Alexandra. Welcome. Welcome, and welcome to our future leaders, which will interview Alexandra Romantsova is the executive director of the Nobel Laureate 2022 NGO, Ukraine Center for Civil Liberties.
Thank you. Thank you. Grazie.
Alexandra, since 2022, Russia war against Ukraine has had a disastrous impact on people, killing, injuring, and destroying. Some of these attacks account for war crimes. In this grim context, the role of civil society organization is key, and that's why you got the Nobel Prize. We are honored to talk with you, and we are very happy that two of our global leaders, future leaders, will have some questions for you. Let me start with Esther Carazzoni, future think tank leader and project officer at IFRI. So your director was on stage a minute ago, now it's you. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the organization, and thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you here, Ms. Romantsova. So, as it was mentioned also a few minutes ago, for most of the international community, war crimes were committed in Ukraine. And in spring 2023, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant against President Putin, so the first time in history against the head of state of a UN security member country and a nuclear power. Ukrainian presidential advisor Mr. Podilak recently described the issued warrant as follows. This is the beginning of the end of the Russian Federation in its current form on the world stage. So in light of this situation, do you think that this warrant is a real step forward when it comes to bringing perpetrators to justice? And realistically, to what extent could this warrant affect Russia's potential bargaining power or diplomatic leverage in the framework of a potential peace process, as well as the reputation of some countries that do not necessarily condemn or openly condemn Russia's actions currently? And last but not least, what else could and should the international community do in order to reinforce accountability?
Thank you. So really deep questions. And I want to just add understanding that war started in 2014, not 2022. Why so? It's important to understood because we started documented war crimes in 2014. And before invasion, 24 February last year, we documented more than 10,000 cases, both in Crimea and Donbass. That was illegal recruitment of people from Crimea to Russian army and send them exactly fighting against the Ukrainian army. That was torturing, kidnapping, illegally detaining more than 5,000 people going through Donbass basement. We call that like this because it's not a jail, exactly. It's not a special places. One of such place of detention and torturing, that was basement of university. Just imagine this really perfect place for education, like not using but their mission, but using like place of torturing and illegally detaining. So all of this 8 years, countries trying to find the solution, diplomatic solution, how it can be Minsk agreement. Maybe we don't need to speak about Crimea and Donbass. Maybe Russians forget about that and will not go in next, but they go in. That's why when we have politician compromise that so sweet prices of oil and gas much better than rule of international law, it's going like a war always. And we exactly was nominated before February 2022. So it's not because our work and documenting war crimes now, together with other 30 human rights organizations, we joined to the big initiative which called Tribunal for Putin. We decided put, main goal in the name. So it's human rights defenders. We collect testimony and evidence more than 40,000 episodes of different international crimes. And we don't have special, we don't have special technology for that. You just go into the place which was occupied and speak with people. You can go into the school which destroyed by Russian forces. You can go into hospitals at Lviv. It's city near the Poland. They shelling hospitals in the city which even not in the nearest part of Ukraine, near the Russian borders. So main idea that this warrant, it's first time reaction to what Putin act last 9 years. And only one problem this warrant, that it's only for Putin. Because 9 years before, whole the power system of Russia Federation exactly supported and not stop all of this aggression. Whole of 9th year, exactly, they kidnap people, they torture them, and now they spread it for all occupation territory. So it's important step. It's a recognition that Putin and such autocracy leaders like him need to be punished for that. It's, ICC, usually African members, African country, they proclaim and give the such criticism about that. You usually accused only president some of African or really weak countries, and now when Putin accused, it's like you really good mention. It's huge country, a lot of money, nuclear powers, but now when he was accused, some African countries say we can arrest him if he come. But why? Exactly, that's what you want. That's why exactly we think about, first of all, it needs to be other cases, and I think minimum one case needs to be open against the Wagner group, because if you heard about Wagner, it's 10 years group, private army, really deep connecting with Russia state, act at the different country of Africa. Mali, Sudan, all of these places where exactly not really democracy rules going. So, and we like Ukrainians, we never look at them till they're not coming to our home. So it's showing that we exactly don't have war somewhere there. We always will have a problem if we are not look at the war, if we are not looking the broken the rules of law. So I think next step, at 6th of June, it will be first hearing. So ICC don't have a Putin at the hall, don't have a Maria Lvova-Belova at the hall. So they will just represent their evidence why they decided make this accusation. But if the Putin so powerful guy and he so believed that he not guilty, why you not take exactly lawyers and not come to GOG? And not protect you, why not? So you are not so tough guy. But it needs to be just one step. I hope that we will have different cases from ICC, and I hope we will exactly establish special mechanism against crime of aggression, against the authority who started aggressive war. It's our task international community. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Filippo Cossa is a student at Bocconi University and ISPI G20 Global Ambassador. Filippo, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. I have another question. There are over 7 million internally displaced people in Ukraine. What should be done to help them, and in particular the youth?
We have refugees near 6 million. Inside the Ukraine, replaced much more people. Just population of Ukraine near 44 millions of people. So near 7 million go outside mostly. They exactly at the Europe, but exist the people who go into Australia, African country, Latin American country, USA, Canada. We have a big diaspora there. But all of these people coming to Europe not because they're trying to find just a consist home here. But as for me, I'm always trying to find something good, you know. Much more people will have a horizontal connection with organization. Look how working democracy institution here. Like women can look exactly how, like in Italy, women's going to parliament, how they take part in leadership. So as for me, it's a sure, psychologically, it's really a hard situation. And a lot of these people feel badly because a lot of them exactly suffering and survivors after war crimes. And it's not so easy to speak about that. Children need to have a support and rehabilitation, and adults same. But they have a possibility to have a horizontal connection, like be implemented to European Union before Ukraine started to be a full member of the European Union. And I think it's our possibility to exactly know each other. But all of these people, they are not just a city. Maybe you heard about that, but Ukrainians, first of all, trying to find the job. Because we don't want to be owner, like we don't want to take loans. We exactly want to be a part of something. So that's why I think a lot of these people will have connection even after the winning. So it's our possibility to know each other better. But main idea that exactly these people have a possibility to come back home. Take a part of reconciliation, reconstruction of Ukraine industry, a reconstruction of Ukraine like place for living, and have this possibility be defended, be secured at their own nation, native place. And young people who exactly rule really important, take a really important role now at Ukraine resistance. I hope they will come back, can finish their education at Ukraine or some university around Europe, and take their place at power, because Ukrainian now exactly only one country from former Soviet country where the young people at the main position. I mean, you look at our president, he really tired, yes, but he exactly a young person, and around of him a lot of people younger. That's not mean they're perfect, but that's mean they look forward and they hearing young population and look at them like really partners in power. Welcome.
Alexandra, I would have liked to ask you how your life has changed, your daily life since the war started, but that would mean ending with a sad note. So I would kindly ask you, how has your life changed after the Nobel Prize was awarded to your center? I mean, you are the executive director of an institute who received the most important prize in the world. Were you expecting that, first of all? No. So you were not expecting that, and someone called you, I guess?
Before 1 hour before official announcement, they call us and told about that, that's all.
Okay, so did you get the call?
Yes.
So you got the call and someone told you, so I'm calling from Oslo, you won the Nobel Prize. Oh, come on, you're kidding.
Exactly.
Okay, so you
first of all, I say, okay, and we are really shocked.
Okay, and what happened after that? What happened in the months after that? How is the life of your institute changed after that?
First of all, they send you huge numbers of how you need to be prepared for award ceremony, because it's really like strict with the rules, all of this. But, first minutes after official announcement, we have red phones, all of us, because before from 24 February, because we stay at the Kiev, we are not relocated. So all the time when exactly we expected that Kiev will be surrounded, we stay at the Kiev. We decided that our organization will stay. And we have a lot of connection with journalists, international journalists from all the world. We're trying to speak about what happened from India, China, Canada, everywhere. So all of these people started call us. And we at the train, because we come back from Warsaw to Ukraine, and we don't have a signal. So that congratulate. So, at that moment, we started feeling not only responsibility for ourselves, but responsibility, for example, for our colleagues, human rights defenders from Belarus and Russia. You know that together with us, receiver of this Nobel Prize, that was Memorial, international organization, really huge movement. Last 30 years, these people collect the information about crimes which was established by Soviet Union times, different regimes. And these people totally banned in Russia Federation. Supreme Court exactly take even their own place where they have archives and all of this. And our next colleague from Belarus, Ales Bialyatsky, he is personally received the Nobel Prize. He's in jail second time because exactly Lukashenko and Putin, it's not people who respect the human rights anyway. So now we have responsibility not only to speak about war crimes at Ukraine, but speak about whole the region, because these two organizations don't have this possibility now, openly speak, from one side. From other side, Norwegian committee, when they make this decision, they explain it in this way, because we want to high up exactly understanding that human rights, it's system against of the war. It's preventing of war, and it's a system, if you respect it, exactly don't give you possibility to start at a war. It's not just mythology or fairy tales. So that's why we now, spend a lot of time around the world. Before Italy, I was in USA. Before USA, I was in South Africa and other places. My colleague, head of our organization, you see maybe her speech at awarding, Alexandra Matvichuk. She is now saying somewhere, or Brussels or somewhere. We're exactly not even sure where she is today. So we have this time, 1 year exactly, when high-level politicians prepared to speak with us, prepared to hearing us. And we trying to invest this attention to human rights, put that it's a priority, and understanding that we need a change international system of justice and preventing of war, because war is changed. They are not same like in 19th centuries. They are not same like Second World War, after which we have UN. So all our system need to be changed. And we can expect that, Martians come and bring us to, right models. No, it's our responsibility to do that today.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you, Filippo. And thank you, Alexandra, for what you told us and what you are doing. Thank you very much. Now, Andrea Cabrini will join me on the stage and he will chair the next session. Andrea Cabrini is Director of Class CNBC. Here he is.
Good afternoon, Paolo.
Thank you very much.
So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks ISPI and Bocconi University for having me. It's a real pleasure. Now it's Future Leaders Conversation. So let me introduce also Chiara De Clesis from Bocconi University and Laura Garballo Perez, Future Business Leader, Customer Experience and Value Proposition Expert from Generali Seguros in Spain. And we're delighted to have at the other end connected remotely Gita Gopinath, First Deputy Managing Director at the International Monetary Fund. We're delighted to have you. Welcome and thanks for your time.
Thank you so much.
All right, fantastic. Let me start with the future business question. Laura, it's up to you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for being here, Mrs. Kopinan. So looking at the global economy today, inflation is rising more and more every day, while signs of financial distress are starting to appear. So my question is, what should central banks do to bring down the prices while avoiding a financial crisis?
Hi, Laura. The question you raised is one of the biggest issues that policymakers are grappling with. Inflation is high in many countries around the world, and we've seen some reduction in inflation, especially in headline inflation. But if you look at the underlying inflation pressures, they seem still strong and somewhat sticky. So therefore, our advice to central banks around the world is that they need to stay resolute in fighting inflation and keeping monetary policy tight so as to make sure that we durably return to the low inflation targets that central banks have set. Now, this is absolutely critical to do so because it's important to maintain central bank credibility. It's critical for inflation expectations to remain anchored. If that were not to be the case, then there is a much harder fight on hand, and it will take an even bigger interest rate increase and even more slowing of the global economy to get inflation back. Now, to your question of the financial stresses, yes, we have seen financial stresses, and especially in the US and Switzerland in March. Now, in a sense, this is not so surprising when you have a period of very low interest rates that's followed then by a very sharp increase in interest rates. It is expected that there would be some financial turbulence. Now, very decisive action was taken by authorities, both in the US and in Switzerland, to prevent this from turning into a systemic event. I think in general, as of now, given the fact that these financial risks remain, I would describe as being contained, it is important to use monetary policy tools like interest rates to bring inflation down, while at the same time using financial policy tools timely, in a decisive manner, to ensure that you don't have spillovers from a financial stress event.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, Gita Gopinath. Chiara, next question.
So, as we know, developing economies are finally leading the charge in economic growth this year. But however, as the IMF notes in its latest World Economic Outlook, below the surface turbulence is building, especially due to growing debt. So my question is, are developing economies moving towards crisis or recovery?
The numbers that we put out for global growth for this year at 2.8% and then staying around 3% over the next 5 years are some of the lowest growth numbers that we have put out in a while. So we do have economies slowing down. An important part of the slowdown for this year comes from advanced economies. And like you pointed out, if you look at the emerging market group as a whole, we have growth projected to be higher this year than last year. Now, that said, there is quite a bit of heterogeneity within each of these income groups and even within the emerging market group. So, for instance, the country that really is driving the headline for the emerging market group is China. Now, China was affected badly from the pandemic last year. This year, they reopened up, and you see this boost in growth that's coming from the reopening, and we have it at 5.2%. That is an important part of why emerging markets as a group are doing better this year than they did last year. But that's not more generally a story. There are many countries that have growth slowing down. To your questions of looking ahead for emerging markets and developing countries, firstly, I think we should all recognize that they have been far more resilient to the sharp increase in interest rates that we're seeing in the advanced world, unlike it's been in the past. There are a couple of reasons for it. One is that many of these countries were ahead of the curve. They started raising interest rates before the advanced world did, and so their interest rates are actually quite high. And secondly, their institutions have gotten much stronger than it was, if you say, about 20 or 30 years ago. So they have much more stable monetary and fiscal policy frameworks, and financial stability is also improved. So that has helped. But that said, we are still living in turbulent times. There could be further shocks coming from even greater tightening in interest rates that's needed to bring inflation down. And so there could be spillovers, which is why we emphasize that it's important for emerging markets and developing countries to remain vigilant and not be complacent. Debt levels are high around the world. We have about 15% of low-income countries that are already in debt distress, and another 45% that are close to debt distress. And we have about 25% of emerging markets whose debt is trading at distress levels. So we have vulnerabilities around the world, and that's why we say it's important to keep policy stable, to make sure that no mistakes happen anywhere around the world in terms of policy making, to ensure that there are limited spillovers. So these are still uncertain times for countries.
Well, thank you for that, Geeta Gopinath. Just let me ask you a question on the role that these future business that's gathered today at the Bocconi University will play in the new economic world. We know that there's a high risk, increasing risk of economic fragmentation. We know we're talking about deglobalization, reglobalization, and there are different areas, US versus China, the G7 that just met, that have different perspectives. How about the impact of this fragmentation on economic growth? What's your idea of the impact? But again, what do you think that the role of future business leader might be in this kind of environment?
The pandemic and the war have both fundamentally changed the way policymakers are thinking about global economic integration. In addition to efficiency considerations, which was really paramount in the 30-year period before the pandemic and the war, countries are, for good reason, thinking also about the importance of resilience, about ensuring that their global supply chains are less risky, and they worry much more about economic security and national security. So in this environment, we expect to see countries diversifying the sources from where they buy their goods, and that's a perfectly fine thing to do. The risk, of course, is that you could end up going down a road of decoupling, or what we call geo-economic fragmentation, where you have economic blocks around the world that trade within each other and in a much more limited way across. And this can be very costly. We've done some estimates, and we've shown that if you have, for instance, decoupling in foreign direct investment, it could reduce global output on a permanent basis by 2%. If you have decoupling that's on trade, so if you have trade-based fragmentation, which is of a severe form, then you could end up with losing global output of around 7%. And that number gets much bigger when you end up with severe technological decoupling. So these costs are large for the world as a whole, but also it is the smaller economies and the more vulnerable economies that get affected. And within countries, it is the poorer people who rely on the fact that we have been able to get goods at cheaper prices around the world that also get affected. So it is very important to have safeguards in this process, in this current world that we're living in. We think it's essential to have what we call pragmatic multilateralism. We need cooperation critically on trade, in debt, and in climate. On trade, it is important for us to make progress on improving the working of the WTO and what can be accomplished through the WTO. On the second aspect, on debt, we need much more timelier debt resolution that's been happening. And we have to deliver on the climate agenda, including on providing climate finance to developing countries. To your questions of what can future leaders do, what can Chiara and Laura do, I think it's absolutely critical first to keep this discussion on the table, to highlight the risks of going down a very slippery slope and the world ending up with tremendous decoupling, because that we know is going to be costlier for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Just talking the climate agenda you were mentioning, for many, the transition to a more sustainable economy is another inflectionary factor looking ahead, because it will involve massive investments, and it's already underway. What do you make of this, and what's your sense of how the transition has been approached and the speed of the transition to get also to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, for example?
There is a lot that needs to be done. There is a bit of a disconnect between the level of ambition that's being displayed by countries and what needs to be done, and a second disconnect between the level of ambition that countries have put on paper and what they're actually doing. Now, I am somewhat more hopeful that in the last several months, we have seen more concerted action to make sure that the climate transition happens. A lot more is needed. I think there is the realization that we don't have the luxury of time. This is slipping away. The analysis we've done for the impact on the world in terms of macroeconomic consequences is that this transition can happen with really minimal costs in terms of growth or output, while you have these huge benefits of just ensuring the existence of the planet. I mean, the benefits are humongous and the costs are really small. But if you delay the transition, even by a couple of years, then you end up with much larger costs to the global population. And therefore, it is important to move much faster and much more decisively than is happening right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And just let me ask you another question, because here in Europe, you know, we've been really badly affected by the economic follow-up of what's going on with the war. And first, it's been an energy crisis, an inflationary crisis. But now we're discussing again in Europe how to look forward in terms of reestablishing some of the most stringent fiscal rules that we used to have. And so countries are discussing how to approach this, not to hit too much the economy, which is already in a situation of high interest rates, but at the same time, how to go back to a fiscal discipline. What's your idea of, you know, how this discussion should be approached, especially in countries with a high debt, like Italy, or in Europe in general?
So debt levels are high, and we are in an environment of high inflation. So on two counts, it is important to have fiscal policy tightening and to have fiscal consolidation. One is to ensure that debt remains on a sustainable path, and importantly, to build up buffers, because as we've seen, shocks keep hitting the economies. But second, we also need to do this so that fiscal policy is helping monetary policy in bringing inflation down durably. If that doesn't happen and they work at cross purposes, then you're going to need even higher interest rate increases, which has important consequences for the cost of debt servicing in several countries, and also risks of triggering much bigger financial stresses. So it's important to bring about fiscal tightness. This is the time to do it. It is important to return to fiscal frameworks that have provided discipline, and of course also to improve the fiscal framework to make sure that you don't have a situation where fiscal policy becomes pro-cyclical, and at the same time you're bringing debt down durably. So this is the time to take the necessary action.
All right, thank you. That was brilliant. Thanks again, Gita Gopinath. This is the applause from Milan. And thanks also, Chiara De Clesis, Laura Garballo Perez. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to join you.
All right, and now we are ready for our next session. We'll be really connected with some of the topics we've just discussed.
Globalization. Game over. High prices, low growth. Is it inevitable? Does the G20 still matter to me? US versus China. Is this our future?
So high prices, low growth, the new normal. Does the new normal looks more like the old normal that we used to know before kind of 15 years ago? This is what we're going to discuss with three keynote speakers and then a roundtable. Let me start with Adam Posen, who's president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, which is connected. Welcome. It's a pleasure having you back here.
Thank you.
Now, Adam Posen, let me start with something which is connected. We've been discussing also with Geeta Gopinath from the International Monetary Fund. We know, and we already watched the video talking about the US and China confrontation. We know that there's a political and geopolitical rhetoric. We know that Taiwan is a case that everyone is discussing. There's a very high concern about the future confrontation on Taiwan. But do you really trust that a decoupling between the US economy and the Chinese economy is possible? Or will it be just de-risking, as the G7 communique mentioned, talking about a relation with China just the other day?
I think no matter what it's called, it's going to be economically harmful. The question is, to what degree does it serve some useful national security or human rights purpose rather than just being harmful? And that's what presumably the G7 was trying to talk about in their meeting just the other day. The full decoupling is infeasible, and now National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen have said that. But they are still trying to get a decoupling in terms of high tech, and they're trying to get potentially a decoupling in terms of outward foreign direct investment towards China and other flows. They've interrupted flows of immigration, of students, of ideas, and venture capital. Now, as I've said when I last spoke with ISPI, it's important to remember that globalization is about more than just trade. It's a whole multi-layered fabric of connections. And some of the connections are actually more important and less resilient than trade. Trade will eventually get through. So if you don't want stuff from China, but you need stuff from China, it gets transshipped from Vietnam or Mexico or Indonesia or somewhere. So I think the issues going forward, which Europe and the US are having to confront along with Japan, Australia, and other allies, first, how much self-dealing does the US do? I mean, along the way to rallying a alliance in conflict with China, how much is it also about we're going to grab as many jobs as possible for industrial workers in the US at the expense of allies? The second is, how much does this become a subsidies race? In line with fears of I and other analysts, the fact is that, once you start going down the subsidies route, it happens very quickly. And we've seen this in Europe's response to the IRA Act, and we can talk about that more later. The third is, how much do you align the rest of the world? Is the US going to be the policeman, as they're doing now with Russian sanctions, that, okay, in this very narrow set of sanctions for a very specific small economy in the whole world, it's one thing to say, if you don't comply with sanctions, we'll kick you out of the US financial system or we'll do something else to you. It's another thing to do that across the whole range of commerce and the whole range of countries interacting with China, which is 2 orders of magnitude higher. And so the feasibility there really becomes a problem. And then finally, the question is, how much can you do this protection without creating corruption and problems inside the US? It's all well and good for Jake Sullivan to say we're doing this with noble motivations about human rights and fair level playing field, and that may even be sincere. but it's not credible that even if it's Trump or DeSantis or even a future US Democrat, that there wouldn't be protection of national champions, erosion of the international system, and in particular, exclusion of developing countries. I think this is part of what the US government at present lost, is the idea that if you do everything by virtue of a club of the G7, excluding China, you either get into a bidding war with China over the loyalty of developing countries, or at least you're not offering them anything. And we saw in the Cold War that was not good for the economic development or the political development of the developing world. So on all these levels, I think that the conflict US-China is going forward. I think a true decoupling is a impossibility. The question is, how much can we limit the damage from the national security-driven narrow de-risking?
Oh, absolutely. But it's not just US and China. How about Europe? You were mentioning the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, that together with the Build Back Better plan has put by the White House kind of $2 trillion on the table for supporting national domestic champions. And for example, well, I might remember that in Davos World Economic Forum in January, I counted 6 American governors from 6 different states. They were approaching European companies, offering them incredible conditions to benefit from the public investment in the US. Clearly, this hasn't been seen very well in Europe. So there's a lot of tension still on this, even though Ursula von der Leyen flew to Washington, starting to have a talk on this side. Are these concerns well-funded, or what do you make of it?
I mean, they are well-funded. There's no question. I published the cover article in the magazine Foreign Policy last month talking about the destructive aspects of this approach of industrial policy the US is taking. The US government is walking around and sometimes it says, this is great, this is the way it should be, let Europe subsidize to match us, let Japan and China subsidize to match us. And I think that's a terrible outcome, but that seems to be what they're saying. But they also tend to tempt European, Canadian, other officials by saying, look, the US isn't going to do enough on climate change anyway. This is the one way we have of potentially having the US in the game doing something good on climate change, so you have to go along with this. And if you believe that, in a sense, you have to go along with this because climate change is existential, and if the US does nothing, then we're all worse off. That said, I can't believe that the US can't do anything except through this massively inefficient, politically self-serving, corrupt process. And so it's a real problem. Now, there is some pushback about the degree to which China and Europe have done their own industrial subsidies, and we've seen the back and forth through decades about Airbus, Boeing, and various other things. But the fact remains that that's the biggest gap in the in the global trade regime, was that we were supposed to have an agreement on subsidies. They've been trying to achieve one since the end of the Carter administration, the end of the Tokyo round, or was it the Uruguay round, excuse me, in the early 80s. And Japan, EU, and US under previous leadership actually came close to having a subsidies code, which would have been pretty harsh on China, and prevented this. Instead, the US has turned its back on this, is going unilateral, and then encouraging others into the bidding war. I think this is destructive. I think, again, it totally ignores the perspective of developing countries. I think it's unworkable. I think it's already causing bad reactions, not just to compensate in EU and China, but in the UK, in India, and a host of other places who say, yeah, great, the US is in favor of subsidies and tariffs, we'll be in favor of subsidies and tariffs. So I think it's a true mistake. I think that, unfortunately, the administration, either because they're too deferential to Congress or they were just blind, didn't think through what this was going to do to Japan, to Europe, to other key industrial allies. And so they didn't make these provisions explicit about being non-discriminatory the way some of the European provisions have been in retaliation. And so they tried to do these workarounds, like there's this complicated workaround that if you do an EV produced by a non-American owned, non-American headquartered company in the US, then that EV gets the tax subsidy if you lease it rather than buy it. I mean, they're doing all these things that then Congress challenges. So it's taking us down a very bad road, and I would like to see, like in arms control, a cutting back of subsidies by mutually pulling back. The final thing I would say to your global future leaders and to this conference is that at the core of this, when we talk about climate, and again, that's the good excuse, if there is one, for the US IRA and CHIPS Act and the rest of Build Back Better, is that the US and Europe are fundamentally mismatched. US is giving subsidies, Europe is giving higher carbon price. There are some problems with higher carbon price, but for the sake of the world and for the sake of economic efficiency, let alone climate change, raising the carbon price is far superior than giving the subsidies. And people don't appreciate that the subsidies approach is going to lead to balkanization of global standards on environment. So unfortunately, I only have negative things to say. I wish I had more positive things.
Yeah, we wish to, but thank you for this, Adam Posen. And let me just end on a very quick note on what's the buzz of the day, because we're trying to keep a vision, medium to long term. But, the large debate today is on the debt ceiling in the US. How concerned or worried are you? Is it so serious or tragic, as they say? Or every year we'll look at this as kind of a domestic game, domestic game theory applied to American policy?
It's, as the saying used to be in the US, it's no way to run a railroad. Or as you said in your opening, Mr. Moderator, discussing about the bad old days, it reminds one of Italy in the 70s and 80s to some degree. Now, because we're not a parliamentary system, you don't have governments falling when they can't get agreement on a budget, but we do have this kind of deadlock. The risks to the economy are probably slightly overstated by the Treasury and some observers, but there's in the short term. If we were to have a default or a crack up of some sort, presumably it would be like 2008 with TARP, where Congress initially refused the bank bailout, and then after the markets crashed 2 days later, they passed it. Presumably something else would happen. But as you said, it's about long term. It's about, do we have this recurring kind of game of instability in US fiscal decision making? And does that mean our governance, rightly, gets downgraded in the eyes of the world, even if not literally downgraded by the bond rating agencies? So this is potentially bad.
Thank you so much. Adam Posen, President of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Thank you. Let me move over to Professor Raghuram Rajan. Professor Rajan is professor of finance at the Chicago Booth School of Business at Chicago University. He's also former governor of the Indian Central Bank. And the first question I'm going to ask Raghuram is, as a former central banker, what we saw in the last 12 to 18 months has been the fastest cycle of interest rates rising from central banks. But given the stickiness of inflation, do you think, Raghuram, that it's likely that they're going to keep it higher for longer? What do you expect?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'd like to thank ISPI and Bocconi, as well as the OECD, for making this possible. This is actually an important question today because interest rates have come up quite sharply from where they were. The problem is that, thus far, we're seeing economies are still quite strong, that labor markets are still quite tight, and the possibilities of inflation maybe tapering from where it was, but staying at a high level are still there. So given that, it is hard to expect that central banks will be done with the disinflation quickly. It is something that is going to take time. Obviously, since they started, we've also seen some evidence of financial instability. The Silicon Valley Bank collapse, as well as some other banks in the United States. So it is possible that high interest rates also cause some financial instability, which could do some of the central bank's work for it. It's not a preferred route, for the central bank, but it is something that could happen. So at present, I would say, if we don't have financial instability, we probably are going to have interest rates high for longer than certainly the markets expect, perhaps well into next year. If we do have financial instability, perhaps central banks may be prompted to cut more quickly. But I think at present, that is not the central scenario.
All right, Professor. One of the things that looking ahead, the future of the economy is more relevant is what they call de-dollarization. Since the euro was born in the late 90s, in developed economies, in developing economies, there's been a lot of talk about de-dollarization. Do you think that after the war in Ukraine, again, there's a revamp of the discussion, it is likely to happen? Is it manageable? Is it feasible? Or it's unlikely to happen?
Well, de-dollarization is an issue that has been talked about for a long, long time, and not just by developing countries and emerging markets. France used to talk about the privilege that the US had because the dollar was used everywhere. Now, it is partly a privilege, it is partly a burden. The US has to provide dollars for the rest of the world to use. That gives it some seniorage revenues, but it also means that the US sometimes has to watch what is happening in the rest of the world as it increases or reduces the supply of dollars. Now, are there alternatives? It was thought at some point that the euro would be an alternative, but so far the use of the euro has plateaued at around, if you look at central bank reserves, maybe 20% is held in euros. Part of the problem is it's not one country, it's many countries, and there's always a fear of fragmentation in the euro, which keeps other countries from piling into the euro. And of course, there are very close links between the euro area and the US. And so countries that want to be independent of the power of the United States don't necessarily find the euro a reasonable alternative. You need deep financial markets, you need liquid financial markets, you need sensible monetary policy. All this the US has, and so it's very hard for countries to move away from the dollar. I think that what some countries are trying, the ones that fear US power, they're moving into gold. But my sense is that gold is a relatively liquid alternative. We will have to wait for a number of years before there is a useful alternative to the dollar. I don't see that emerging in the very near future.
Well, that was very clear. Thanks again. We have to leave it there, Professor Ragurajan. Thank you, Professor. Let's have a round of applause. Okay, thank you. Because it's panel time, let me introduce our panel speaker, starting with Anushka Alexander, who's Future Business Leader, Senior Manager, Strategy and Innovation, Global Public Policy at Deloitte, together with Daniel Gross, Director of the Institute for European Policymaking at Bocconi University. They are supposed to be here physically, but I can see them. Please, welcome, welcome. And let me also introduce connected remotely, Regina Meyer, Global Head of Markets at KPMG. Here we go. And Vera Thornsten, Head of the Center of Global Trade and Investment Studies of the Foundation Getulio Vargas, Co-Chair of the T20 in India. Welcome. Thanks, everyone, for your time. We're delighted to have you all for the discussion. Now, let me start, Daniel Gross, with you. We heard a lot about, the future of the economy from the IMF, from Pedersen and Professor Ragurajan, but how about Germany? You know very well Germany. You've been discussing with us many times the economy. We know that Germany grew in the last couple of decades on a model based on exports, mainly on exports towards China. Now things are rapidly changing. Do you know that there's another possible model for keeping that pace of growth? And how about the restructuring of the German economy, which is at the heart of Europe?
Thanks a lot. I always thought that the German economy was overrated.
Overrated?
Certainly for the last 10 years or so, because Germany was growing, but not particularly quickly, not much more than the euro area average. And that happened in an environment where all the capital of the Eurozone was going to the country. So it should really have overperformed, but its performance was just middling, not bad. Therefore, I think doesn't have a big or glorious past to look at. We know that in certain areas, industry basically was resting on its laurels. They exported the same goods, and then they went to China and produced the same goods, which so far were in high demand. I know that changes. So I think for the next few years, it will be rather tough. But in the end, I don't think that this means, let's say, the end of the German economy, for one simple reason. The German industry, like that of Italy also, is really under the competition of the entire world, right? Chinese, American, Asian, others. And they have to survive on their own. They're competent engineers, there's a competent public administration, so I think after a period of weakness, they'll get back on their feet.
Well, but if the German economy was overrated, was the Italian economy underrated? What do you make of that? Because looking at, from the European Commission outlook in terms of growth this year, Italy will be at 1.2, Germany will be lagging, which is kind of new, looking at those kind of rankings.
We shouldn't forget that, let's say 20 years ago, Germany was the sick man of Europe and the German economy, right? Remember the famous cover page of The Economist? So the fortunes of nations change over time. And Italian industry had to labor under a big handicap, namely the risk premium, which still exists, and perhaps a less strong industrial base to start with. But since it kept the pace more or less, it has shown that it actually had some internal strength, which were not visible because of the policy environment, which didn't help them. And now that that evens out, I could very well see a period where Italy outperforms.
Absolutely. Now let me make it really clear, as I'm the only Italian on the stage, it is not that bad news for German economy or good news for Italian economy. The interconnection is so close that any time Germany is slowing down, Italian manufacturer, for example, sector will likely go down as well. But let me move to Vera Torstensen, because the world and also the economic world is looking for some kind of direction, and the G20 was born as a body to coordinate developed and developing economy just after the great financial crisis. Is it still a working body, an efficient body, or a body which has a real power of keeping an address to the world economy?
Yes, it's a big yes, the answer, because there is no alternative. Look, if you see what's going on, all the international organizations are in crisis because of the crisis or related to it, the other crisis. And so the G20 is now the only forum where developing countries can put their own problems at the hand. Look what's going on what's happening in G7. G7 now is a forum to discuss the war with Russia and the issue of China. But look at the problems, the huge problems that developing countries they have, right? We can talk about the pandemic. Who said that is over? It's not over. Another virus can come. Look at the debt of the developing countries are huge. Why? Because the developed countries throw a lot of money during the crisis, the last crisis. And so the issue of the debt, take a look of the developing countries they're completely blocked to ask money from the IMF. Why? Because of the problem of the US and China. Look, the issue of food security. It's a huge problem around the world. And look at one of the pressing questions is about trade. Look, the discussion of decoupling, the fight between US and China. look at the impacts of this in developing countries. We developed countries, we do not want to have to choose between the United States and China because it depends on the two. And so the issue of now that is a new word, the risking, is nice. But the question is, what is the risking? Should Brazil has to choose again another hub to have trade and so on? So we are really worried about the war, but you cannot say that the war is the only issue around the world. There are so many issues, and the crisis of the institutions. This is why we need to have G20 working. Half developed countries, half developing countries, and you have to find a way out.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. But Regina Mayor, geopolitics is shaping also corporate and companies' decision and strategy. We've been talking about nearshoring, reshoring. How do you think that companies are navigating into this geopolitical uncertainty?
So there's a lot of concern about global supply chains now and the response to geopolitical risk. A lot of the CEOs that we work with in today's world have never known anything other than true economic interdependencies and a seamless flow of trade. And now we're struggling with lots of different risks and how we change the supply chains. Just a few data points that I find particularly intriguing. We've seen global trade flows, trade volumes increase substantially post-pandemic and then drop off in 2022 to near single-digit levels in terms of year-over-year adjustments. And we've seen a 5x increase, IMF data, 5x of punitive trade or trade restrictions from 2017 to today. So you see trade restrictions ramping up, companies starting to evaluate optionality in their supply chains and trying to figure out, how do I not create sole dependence on one particular geography or another? It's particularly obvious when you look at global commodities like oil and some of the supply chains around crude oil, but we'll start to see that in terms of manufacturing with what you said, nearshoring, reshoring, or friend-shoring, right, the other buzzword that's around today. And so what we believe and what we're seeing our clients undertake right now is cost is less of an issue and efficiency is less of an issue, but de-risking and optionality in your global supply chain become the prominent factor that we're trying to achieve. Mind you, this will take years to achieve, years. These are not simple overnight changes.
All right, Regina Mayor, thank you for that. But we know there's a lot of uncertainty out there, but if we can take one thing for granted is that economic growth will depend on the ability of different economies to innovate. Now, Anushka, Alexander, you are an expert in terms of innovation. How can Europe create a more friendly environment for innovation, which is not an individual decision, it takes an ecosystem to create real innovation, true innovation?
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you for having me here and taking part in this forum. You want to have macroeconomic policies to create a stable economic environment characterized by low inflation to foster favorable economic conditions for business growth, investment, and job creation. So it's on the macroeconomic side where innovation is influenced. When new innovative and ideas or in business models or technologies are introduced, they can create economic growth and opportunities for businesses. What I mean is that there is a positive relationship. The positive relationship between innovation and economic growth is undeniable. So throughout history, innovation has been a driving force for economic growth, empowering nations and improving the lives of people worldwide. So, the Industrial Revolution, the invention of electricity, or today, the digital technologies are all examples of how innovation has transformed economies and create opportunities for businesses. the fact is that what we need to ask ourselves, what are the regulations there are, what types of restrictions in labor market there are, what are the opportunities there are for in terms of policies, so that can improve innovation. Innovation is also influenced by the quality of universities. So if we look, for example, at the United States, there is a really strong tie between innovation and universities that leads, for example, to the creation of the Silicon Valley. So there is not much of that kind happening in Europe. So Europe, I think, should the European Union should promote collaboration between universities and the private sector, and the degree also to how they partnership between each other, so that can foster, let's say, innovation and creation of economic growth and business development. What can I say is that there is another factor that we need to foster in Europe, is the fact that is the capital market. The capital market and the access to funding, for example, for the startup ecosystem. So when you look, for example, at the United States and China, they are successfully fostered collaboration, the access of funding for innovation. And another aspect to look at is the bureaucratic and regulatory to streamline, environment to streamline and to foster entrepreneurial mindset.
It sounds really familiar to an Italian, because in Italy we are facing the same challenges. But Daniel Gross, we were talking about capital markets, funding, research and innovation, but at the same time, Europe has very high ambition in terms of creating a common policy for technology, for energy, for defense. More common debt will be needed, or do you think this is not the case, also given the interest rates level? What's the take on this?
First of all, let me say that the question of fostering innovation in Europe, and especially the step from innovation to application and business success, is something which I have heard in Europe for 35 years and more. And I've been in Brussels quite some time. And the story is always the same. We have to foster collaboration between university and enterprises. Yes, but if it hasn't been done for 35 years, we should ask ourselves perhaps some more fundamental questions. And we have some successful European programs for research, but they are of a completely different order of magnitude of the public debt we are talking about. The EU spends on research and development, let's say, a couple of billion per year, 10 if it's a good year. We have public debts in the thousands of billions. So this is really not a question of having more common debt to create more university collaboration or university corporate collaboration. It's really something that has to be done at the national level, the regulatory environment. And if we need some more funding, I'm not against European funding for research, actually. If we were to cut 1/10 of the agricultural budget, we would have more than enough. Why is it not happening? I give you just a story of when the NGO program was negotiated. Already 2 years ago now, or 3 years ago.
3 years ago, yeah.
And the Commission, of course, said we should also invest not only in railways, roads, everything else, but also in more research. Okay? Let's increase the research budget by 20%. And then the heads of states get together and negotiate the details. And of course, there's more demands than there is supply. And at a certain point, they look around, okay, we need a couple of billions. Where do we take them? Is anybody defending research? What single head of state will defend research which goes to everybody? Nobody. So in the end, the decision was easy. We cut the research demands from the Commission, and hey presto, we have enough money for everybody. That's what we need to change in Europe, these decision-making processes, and then we can talk about having more money for research.
Yeah, okay. This is a very good point. But let me move back to Vera Torstensen, because talking about a G20, Indonesia's been chairing G20 last year, and this is India's year. And in a couple of next 2 years, we're going to have Brazil, and I think it's South Africa. Yeah, it's South Africa. So we're talking more and more about the Global South. But is the Global South kind of a unique thing, or inside the Global South there are kind of different position, negotiating and dealing, with the superpower on different issues in different ways? What's your take?
Look, the crisis is so huge that now developing countries are trying to put an order in their own interests, right? And it's true. The world's Global South is increasing, and everybody's worried about this. Is also the new word of the non-G20 members. Again, what the G20 led by developing countries want. Look, they want to change the United Nations Council. Do you agree that something is wrong with it? Yes, it's not functioning anymore, right? Something is wrong with it. The model of the Second World War has reached a big dead end, right? Look to what's going on IMF. IMF has money, but is not lending money. Look, because a lot of developing countries lend money from China. It's amazing. And the United States not allowing that the IMF perform their own function. And why? Because China is not in the Paris Club and so on. So something is also wrong with IMF, right? Go to the WHO. Look, I spent 30 years of my life with the WHO. What's going on? Completely blocked by the US because of the fight with China. Because what they want is to force us, developing countries again, to choose sides. Again, you are not going to fight with China, neither with the United States, because you have mutual interests. And look to environment. Environment is a big issue again. There's a lot of money to make the research and make the new proposal and put the green industry at work. So the question is, look, that there are a new world and a new kind of multilateral organizations. You have to rebuild the old ones and to find a new position. And that is exactly what developing countries are trying to do in the G20. You have a huge opportunity in doing this now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Regina Meyer, we haven't mentioned energy so far, but we know that if we look back 12 months, spring to summer 2022, prices were skyrocketing, and then there was a decline and normalization of energy prices. But recently, OPEC Plus countries, again, they're cutting supply to increase prices. It's kind of a risky business because they're pushing also the global economy more toward the recession. They're on top of the increase of interest rates. So what do you make of that? And do this game is going to pay? Because we've seen volatility in prices, but at the end of the day, not that large increase maybe they were hoping.
Right. I think the world is at a little bit of a ho-hum when it comes to energy, whereas it was such a focal point, to your point, 8, 9, 10 months ago, and now people are pretty blasé, pretty relaxed about what's happening in energy. I do expect that OPEC will continue to try to cut production. The price is not where they need it to be for their national budgets. Also find it fascinating, the conversation we keep having about debt in developing countries. I'm dialing in from Houston, Texas, and all we can talk about in the US is the pending debt ceiling and the amount of borrowing that the US continues to do. So debt is a huge problem all around the world. But back to energy prices, I think we're in a little bit of a Goldilocks situation, right? It's not too high, it's not too low. It's pretty comfortable for my Western public company clients, but I think the national oil companies would like the price to be higher. I expect at the upcoming meeting in early June that OPEC might try to reduce production again, and because the Russian barrels are still getting to the market as well. So we see demand continuing to grow, but it hasn't been demand that's been completely unleashed because we haven't seen a complete reopening of China. And because supply and stocks have continued to rebuild, we haven't had huge energy volatility and huge energy price spikes. What's also interesting to note is that European spot electricity and spot gas prices are back to normal levels. And last year, that was the story of the season, the incredibly high prices for gas and for electricity to fuel the European economy. And now those are back in the normal range. So I think it's not too hot, not too cold. We'll keep going, but I do think OPEC will continue to try to cut production because they would like to see the average price in the 80s.
They would love that. They would love that, but we don't know if they're going to get it. So Anushka and Alexander, again, here we discussed with Vera Torstensen the G20 efficacy in creating a common vision for the future of the world and economy. You've been looking and living from the inside for quite a lot. So can you tell us if you trust G20 to remain the main body we have to looking for the future?
Absolutely. I do believe that G20 plays a crucial role in global governance. And for me, it remains a critical platform when it comes to an inclusive dialogue to addressing global challenges and fostering international cooperation and resolve, the issues that the world is challenging. So I think it's relevant for several reasons. Among them, let's say, first, it's for the global economic governance. It represents around 85% of the global GDP and the 2/3 of the world's population. So this makes it an important platform for discussion on global economic issues. Its role at the 2008 financial crisis was instrumental. Secondly, I think it's, as Vera said, representation and inclusivity, because it brings together a pool of countries, both from advanced and emerging economies. So this diversity allows for a more inclusive dialogue in cooperation in solving the issues, global challenges. And thirdly, multilateralism, especially in an era of increasing geopolitical tension. So it remains really a platform for the leaders and opportunities for leaders for cooperation. However, yes, it has its limitation. One criticism is that the G20 lacks of accountability because it doesn't have a permanent secretariat, or its effectiveness depends on the divergent aspect and the priorities of its members, so that can hinder consensus building. But yeah, I think it's long-term relevance will depend on its ability to adapting of evolving global dynamics and its effectively address global issues.
Oh, fantastic discussion, but now I have to move to our final keynote speaker. Pascal Lamy is the former director of the World Trade Organization. Today, he is the coordinator of the Jacques Delors think tank and vice president of the Paris Peace Forum. First question I would like to ask Pascal Lamy is about friendshoring, nearshoring. We've been discussing this so far on the stage, but we started discussing at the beginning of the pandemic, looking at supply chain, global supply chain restructuring. Do you think that now is the time that these things are happening, or it is not the case? Pascal Lamy.
Well, let me first thank ISPI, Bocconi, and the OECD for this session. I'll try to answer your question right away. I think throughout history, trade patterns have been shaped by a variety of parameters, forces, factors, geography, of course, distance, technology, modes of transport, ideology, whether protectionism or liberalism was the right way to go. Power politics, emperors have usually tried to exploit their empires for economic reasons. And I think we could regroup them in sort of two basic categories: geoeconomics and geopolitics. The latest wave of globalization, the one we've had during, let's say, 40 to 50 years, between the 1970s with the opening of China until roughly 2010, was a period where overall geoeconomics trumped geopolitics. Geoeconomic forces were shaping globalization and trade patterns more than geopolitics, geopolitical rivalries, big powers, oppositions, and conflicts. At the time, trade opening was seen as dominantly a win-win exercise. That was the way to go. This is when the WTO, the ancestor of GATT, was created. The notion being that if you do something better than I do and you do something better than I do, we have a rational interest to trade. I will benefit from your efficiency. You will benefit from my efficiency. Win-win. International division of labor, specialization, global supply chains have expanded in such a way that the system became much more efficient with, as a result, economic growth, notably in developing countries. So overall, interdependence, a good thing. Opening trade, globalizing production systems, the way to go. This has changed under two major forces. One which had been there for a long time is the social impact of international division of labor, notably in places where social safety nets are weak, and that is the case with the US, which of course matters a lot because they are a very big player in trade, such as EU or China. Second element, which in my view is the main one, is of course great power rivalries and this sort of Thucydidean war, whether you call it cold or quasi-cold, between US and China, which is there for the 50 years to come, unfortunately, in my view, but that's what we have to cope with. And as a result of that, interdependence is seen as a weakness, not as a strength. Economic trade interdependence makes these big powers vulnerable, and they want to react to this. So security becomes factor number one in their international global posture and trumps efficiencies. This is what leads to nearshoring, friendshoring, deglobalization. How far? That's the big question for the future. In my view, it's happening in some areas. You can see that in numbers on investment flows, who are smaller than they used to be, not in trade flows, which is still much higher than it used to be, and in some sectors like the technological frontier, where dual-use civilian and military purposes is the rule for new digital tools. This is one element which pulls in a direction of some deglobalization. There are other elements that pull in other directions, such as the big growth in services, which is now becoming the main part of international trade, whereas goods have a less importance. So all in all, trade globalization is different. It's not deglobalization, it's a different one with components and flows, more services than goods, and maybe more regional than global. I think this is the way to go, but to put it simply, this is not deglobalization. It's a different kind of globalization, and I've always said globalization is efficient and painful, and I'm afraid that deglobalization would be inefficient and painful.
Yeah, and indeed, Pascal Lamy, they call it reglobalization. But in my understanding, you're confirming that WTO is kind of in a crisis. We heard from Vera Tonstensen today that it's treated like a hostage, sometime by the US, sometime by China. Is there any chance or any strategy to revamp and relaunch the role of WTO for global trade and commerce and above that?
Well, WTO is the global organization in charge of trade opening, of reducing obstacles to trade, whether tariffs or non-tariff measures. This is the big job, the mission statement of the World Trade Organization, and it has worked quite formidably for the last 50 years. If you look at obstacles to trade at the border today as compared to what they were in the past. This being said, the WTO, as a member-driven organization, it's not so much an institution as an organization, the direction of which depends on its members, and notably its main members, US, EU, China, is highly dependent on this geo-economic, geopolitical balance, which I've already mentioned. The geo-economic side of WTO is impacted by the changing nature of obstacles to trade, which in my view are less about protecting domestic producers than protecting domestic population from risk, what I call protectionism, which in my view is overall declining, as opposed to precautionism, which overall is rising. This raises new issues for WTO, digital trade, trade and environment, the EU carbon border measure adjustment, the EU deforestation directive have a big impact on trade. The geopolitical side also matters, as insofar as US remain a major trade power. And let me put it very bluntly, without beating the bush, the US have left de facto the WTO since Trump paralyzed, blocked the dispute settlement mechanism, which is well known to have been the jewel in the crown of WTO. As such, there is a big problem because if the US, which is one of the 3 or 4 major trade powers, does not play a ball in WTO, nothing much happens. So what's the way forward? In my view, the WTO should focus on geo-economic, trade and environment, digital trade, things that really matter for the future, and where the rules for the moment are not well shaped. And second, try to push back against this geopolitical dominance within the membership of WTO in creating as large as possible a coalition of countries that do not want to be either on the US or on the Chinese side, or at least want to keep a flexibility to decide which direction to go. And I think the EU should be the pilot of such a coalition in WTO.
All right, thank you so much for this, Pascal Lamy, together with Adam Posem and Raghuram Rajan, our keynote speakers. Let's have a round of applause to our keynote speakers and to our 4 panelists, Anushka Alexander, Daniel Gross, Regina Mayer, and Vera Tonstensen. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, because we're ready for the following session.
Rising population, good or bad news for development? SDGs, dream or reality? What's my future in an aging Europe? The rise of Africa, is it now or never?
right, development and demography. This is what we're going to discuss now. We've got our panelists on the stage, so welcome and thanks again to Professor Francesco Billari, Tetsushi Sonobe, Dean and CEO of Asian Development Bank Institute, and Naja Ben Mimoun, Future Think Tank Leader, Research Associate, Middle East Council on Global Affairs, with Gala Diaz-Langu, Executive Director of CHIPE, co-chair of T20 Indians in virtual attendance, and our keynote speaker, Camilla Bruckner, representative of the UN system in the EU, and Dubravka Suica, Vice President for Demography and Democracy at the European Commission. I would like to start with Dubravka Suica, asking what the main lessons are based on the trends of democracy. We know growing population worldwide, aging population in the West and in Europe in particular, and I might say also in Italy in particular. Dubravka Suica, what do you make of that?
First of all, I would like to thank you very much for the opportunity to address you today, but I also want to thank to ISPI, to Bocconi University, but also to OECD for organizing this event. I hope to join you in person on another occasion. When it comes to the question of learning lessons from demographic trends, we can discuss this topic for hours. I'm aware that our audience today already knows more than the basics, so I will focus on 3 important points, hoping that you, future leaders, develop them in your reflections and later in your careers. Firstly, we need to be aware of the changes in society to be able to design measures addressing the challenges of demographic change and trends. All of us know demographic change is nothing new, but we are increasingly realizing its importance and relevance both in the European Union and globally. Aging and depopulation are, for example, key trends in the European Union. However, a different age structure and a different distribution of the population in the territory are not necessarily negative. Aging is not just about growing old, it's about our entire life cycle, because we are aging from the day we are born. For example, the age structure of the European Union can be explained by the increase in the average age. We are living longer and healthier lives. This is good news. Nonetheless, if in the European Union the number of people aged 85 is set to double by 2050, then we must rethink our approach to policymaking when it comes to health and social systems. This is my first point. Accessible, affordable, and high-quality care services represent a social investment which brings multiple returns for individuals, for societies, and for the economy. That is why we came forward with the European Care Strategy in September last year. This is an initiative that is deeply anchored in the demographic change that the European Union is going through. We looked at care from the perspective of the care provider and the care receiver. And we look at care throughout the life cycle for children and for the elderly, as well as for anyone else who needs care at any stage in their life. Tapping into the job creation potential of the care sector and its digitalization and innovation opportunities will help unlock economic growth, create jobs, and allow people with family or so-called informal care responsibilities to increase their participation in the labor market. Furthermore, the rural population is on average significantly older and shrinking more than the urban population. And women and young people tend to leave their rural regions of origin. We need a robust intersectorial policy approach to address the population and demographic challenges and to close the gaps between rural and urban areas in terms of access to services. A healthier aging also allows people to keep contributing to the society for some time beyond the current retirement age. We will have to find ways to collect and convey such energy back in the economy. It can be through volunteering, work, mentorship, or other mechanisms that we will have to design. My second point starts from the observation that today there are 6 million open jobs vacancies across the Union. Increasing participation to the labor market and facilitating mobility within the European Union will be crucial. However, it will not be sufficient to mitigate demographic challenges, structural labor shortages, or to help the transition to green and digital economies. Legal migration needs to be part of the solution. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we became more aware that as many as 13% of key workers performing essential functions, from doctors to nurses and drivers, are migrants. This requires viable legal migration strategies to attract the talent needed. To sustain economic growth, open trade is therefore more important than ever, as it enables access to other markets, creates new revenue resources, and reduces the burden on domestic demand. And there are different sensitivities in the various member states, but we are setting up a European Union-wide tool called the Talent Pool, which should help fill these gaps. I know that Bocconi scholars are publishing many papers on artificial intelligence analysis applied to these topics. Although we have a different focus, we are aware of them and welcome such scientific contribution. And my third point focuses more on the qualitative side of the human resources we need. We often speak about the skills mismatch. For example, as we advance towards digitalized services, we need more IT professionals and fewer office workers. If, for instance, we are really going towards self-driven vehicles, all the people currently employed as drivers need to have an alternative career path, possibly through and upskilling. And as I said, I could discuss this topic for much longer, but I understand you have another question for me.
Yes, I do. And thanks also for mentioning Bocconi's paper on behalf of Professor Billari, who was very happy on that. But you mentioned the dramatic mismatch between demand and offer on the European job market. We know 2023 is the year of skills in Europe. So the question is, how can we win the challenge to reskill, upskills, and also give the right skills to the new generation to be fit into the new economy that will have to be greener and more sustainable?
Skills have never been higher on the Union's policy agenda. They are one of the 4 pillars of the Green Deal Industrial Plan and appear in the recent Net Zero Industry Act and Competitiveness Strategy of the 16th of March this year. We are facing a huge digital skills gap in Europe. Almost 1 out of 2 Europeans does not possess the basic digital skills. This becomes more urgent when you consider that 90% of jobs require some level of digital skills. As I mentioned a minute ago, to tackle this digital skills gap, we need to encourage more people to embark in tech careers and to provide up and reskilling to the current working population. We must support them so they are able to use, master, and design new technologies. We have set ambitious targets for skills in the Digital Decade Policy Program. Our ambition is to reach 20 million information and communications technology professionals in Europe. We are also promoting access for women in this field. And we must ensure that 80% of European citizens possess at least the basic level of digital skills by 2030. Last month, we issued 2 proposals for a Council recommendation, both aimed at improving the provision of digital skills in education and training. Last year, we issued a Council recommendation on a European approach to micro-credentials for lifelong learning and employability. Hopefully, Member States will swiftly adopt all these Council recommendations. In addition, we created a European education area to support Member States in building more resilient and inclusive national education and training systems. We also have a European strategy for universities adopted last year, which seeks to strengthen local skills development and innovation capacity in a way that prevents brain drain and fosters regional development. Bocconi participates in the flagship European Universities initiative that emphasizes both excellence and inclusion in close cooperation with the local work environment and communities. A rich education can also help to address territorial imbalances. Territorial demographic differences can be shaped by shifting residential preferences. They can also be shaped by the internal movements of the youth. Recognizing the importance of these issues, In January this year, the Commission adopted the communication on harnessing talent in Europe's regions, which focuses on the challenges brought about by the demographic transition. Our communication identifies 82 regions in 16 member states, accounting for almost 30% of the entire European Union population, which we can support. These regions are affected by the decline of the working age population, a low share of university and higher education graduates, or a brain drain of their young population. Additionally, it also introduces the talent booster mechanism, which will support European regions affected by the accelerated decline of their working age population to address the impact of the demographic transition. It will provide targeted assistance and knowledge to regions caught in a talent development trap, supporting them in developing and successfully implementing tailored strategies. Our communication is the first key deliverable of the European Year of Skills during this year. We will focus on the need of reskilling and upskilling to mitigate brain drain, skills mismatches, and labor shortages. And these are just a few of the key policy issues we are delivering to support our member states and their regions. We also must support them as they face the challenge of reskilling and upskilling. It is our duty to ensure that our workforce, and youth in particular, is fit for a green and digital future.
Thank you so much, Dubravka Suka, for bringing the European Commission perspective in this forum. But let me introduce the second keynote speaker, Camilla Bruckner. Good afternoon and welcome to our forum, Camilla Bruckner. Yeah, we don't hear you, so I don't know if you're on mute or what, but let's try to fix it. In any case, let me go with the question, because you've been seeing, the European development policies in action in recent years, but we know that the war has been a disruption from many points of view. Do you think that these development policies are changing, and what's your idea of that?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly,
oh, yeah.
yes.
I can hear you, can hear me. So thank you, first of all, for inviting me for this very prestigious event, and an honor to be among so many distinguished speakers. Yes, I think there has been a change, but also an acceleration of pre-existing policies, such as the Team Europe. But let me just start somewhere else. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, as you mentioned, has had a stark effect on food, energy, and finance worldwide. It has catalyzed the most severe global cost of living crisis in a generation, and affecting the lives and livelihoods of an estimated 1.6 billion people. It has also pushed more than 71 million people into poverty at a faster rate than we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic. Development and humanitarian policy have been called to mitigate this global impact, and the EU has been at the forefront of this work, and often in close partnership with the UN and its agencies. So a very strong partner for addressing these issues. For example, the European Commission and its member state, as Team Europe, pledged over 1 billion euros to address the food crisis in the Sahel, and 633 million euros for the Horn of Africa, just on those two alone. At a more political level, EU leaders have been vocal supporters of the efforts of the UN Secretary General to agree on the Black Sea Grain Initiative that has effectively mitigated global food prices. EU institutions have also committed to remaining engaged in pre-existing crises in Africa, Middle East, Asia, Pacific, and elsewhere. But as the war continues to rage, requiring large finances from the EU and its member states, ODA, we fear, is likely to be affected in the long term. So the mobilization of investment capital foreseen through the EU Global Gateway and Team Europe initiatives presents an important opportunity to scale up resources to put the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, back on track. But we need to make sure that this work goes beyond connectivity and infrastructure in middle-income countries, and also advances the whole socioeconomic and environmental dimension of the SDGs. leaving no one behind, and particularly aimed at the most vulnerable. Developing and fragile countries have been hit the hardest, as we know, by recent crises, including the global consequences of the war, climate disasters before and now, COVID pandemic, local conflicts, and other structural insecurities. So putting the SDGs back at the center would help secure engagement and support from EU's partners in the South, and to rebuild the trust with the global North. As a strategic partner of the EU, and given the UN's knowledge, authority, our local presence, and the confidence we often enjoy with governments due to our impartiality, we think we have much to offer in this process of modernization of development cooperation to mobilize the larger public and private finance for the SDGs. So this is, yes, changes, but also a solid cooperation.
Let me ask you a quick one on SDGs, which are also your physical backdrop today, because you said, put them again at the center of policies, also in Europe, because basically our sensation is that we're not on track to meet these goals by 2030. So what could be done, and by whom, to put them back at the center of politics and strategy?
So we are, as you know, at the midway point of the 2030 agenda. And without a surge in commitment, solidarity, and transformative action, we will indeed miss the SDGs and their promise to end poverty, reduce inequality, and protect the environment. But I must underline that this does not make them any less relevant. On the contrary, the multiple crises of the last 3 years have indicated and inflicted a major blow to the SDGs implementation efforts, as we've seen. Millions have been pushed back into poverty, inequalities have risen, the rights of women and girls have been under siege, and the urgent and existential business of averting climate catastrophe has been undermined. So many critical policy changes, innovations, transitions, and investments have not been advanced at the speed or scale required. But we know it's possible. We have never had access to so much knowledge, technology, and resources. The SDG Summit in September 2023, in fact, in a few months, provides a unique opportunity to reignite the momentum. The UN Secretary General has called on member states and all key stakeholders to support a rescue plan for people, planet, with clear deliverables on 3 fronts. And let me mention these 3. First, a decisive action to better support developing countries by massively scaling up finance to at least 500 billion per year through long-term lending at lower interest rates, debt relief, and the creation of a robust and effective sovereign debt resolution mechanism, and expanding contingency finance to countries in need and driving both public and private investments towards the SDGs. Second, national commitments to the SDG transformation to be presented at the summit. This could include clear benchmarks to reduce domestic poverty and inequality levels by 2027 and 2030, and in tandem with the national determined climate contributions under the COP. And thirdly, we need to see a full participation of a wide range of stakeholders with the engagement of civil society, youth, private sector, and other actors the summit will gather and in the preparation up to, and the commitments on the follow-up. So the SDG summit will be accompanied by other key moments, including the Climate Ambition Summit, the COP28, the Summit of the Future in 2024, and other for us to mobilize maximum momentum. And we have a path, so we have no excuse. And this can now become a moment of our world to pivot from fear to hope, and from deepening the pessimism to accelerated action. So this is really the moment we have to change course. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Camilla Bruckner. Thank you so much. This is the applause from Milan, Bocconi University. And we discussed European policies, skills, we discussed development and SDGs policies. Now let's talk demography, Professor Billari. I know it sounds frustrating because you might talk hours on that, days on that, but I have to ask you to wrap up in a few minutes. What are the main challenges that the world is facing in terms of demographic trends?
Thank you very much for this question, and thanks for the global interest on demography. I'll start not from a challenge, but from something, let me say, hope rather than fear. The global demographic transition is broadly a positive, a great achievement of humanity. We are talking about the fight against early death and the fight against not being able to choose the number of children. Now, at the global level, we are at the level of life expectancy 72, which is unprecedented, even if COVID had some hit on this level. And we have a number of children, which is on average 2.3 per couple. And again, this is an unprecedented outcome at the global level. So I have to say, when we talk about demography at the global level, we have to talk about a general positive achievement where humanity has managed to improve our lives. However,
and it keeps improving. And
it keeps improving. It keeps improving. However, there are challenges. You asked me about challenges. Of course, I could name many, but let me mention two challenges. The first challenge has already been mentioned by at least the second keynote speaker, Mrs. Bruckner, and it has to do with SDGs. And it's about the speed of the demographic transition. Of course, globally, life expectancy is 72, but we still have many countries, many regions lagging behind in terms of infant mortality, maternal mortality, poverty. We have many areas in which the right to choose a number of children is still into question. So we have different speed at the global level. We know that the world is projected to keep growing from 8 billion to about 10 billion according to UN projections by 2050. But in particular, in some areas, this speed of growth will be substantial. UN projections for sub-Saharan Africa are talking about a doubling of the population from here to 2050, from about a little bit more than 1 to more than 2 billion. So the different speed of the demographic transition, the different situation at which countries and regions are in the demographic transition is creating global imbalances. There have always been global imbalances, and now maybe we are more aware of them, and the SDGs are posing a good challenge on this. Of course, these global imbalances in population growth are putting pressure on migration. We heard before the EU commissioner mentioning the shortage of labor, and we are talking of big population growth in sub-Saharan Africa, mostly young people. Of course, here there is a challenge in terms of multilateral governance of population change. The third main challenge is something, again, global. Maybe we'll go to talk about that when we discuss Europe or Italy, but it's population aging. It's already been mentioned by the EU Commissioner and Vice President, but the world has never seen population aging before. Population aging is broadly a positive consequence of our ability to fight against early death and to control the number of children. However, we don't know how to deal with that. It's the first time in history we've seen population aging. It's an unprecedented change. Now at the global level, we are 10% of the population, a bit more, around 10%, 65 plus. The projection for 2050 is 16%. We need to change our frame of mind and think on how to deal with a global aging population.
As a resource, not just as a problem.
Of course, it is a challenge, but we are forced to turn that into a resource. We are forced to use higher productivity. We are forced to learn from the areas that are aging faster. And in this sense, maybe imbalances are good because when we have countries that are aging and wealthy, they can pave the way to the countries that may age before being at that wealth level.
Absolutely. And talking about imbalances and also resources with a large potential, let's talk women, because women participation at the labor force globally is stuck at 47% versus 74% for men. So how can we get the mainstream policy, gender policy, when we think at development policies and the future of the job market? Let me talk and ask this to Gala Diaz-Langu, who is connected remotely. Welcome to the forum.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the question particularly. Well, regarding the challenges of the aging population in general, it is very important to notice that there is absolutely no trade-off to closing gender gaps and to building the better conditions we can for the end of the demographic dividend, what is known as the aging of population, where we will have ultimately more people dependent of the income that active people create than active people in the labor market. How come? Demographic is obviously key to economic development, social welfare, etc. We've heard quite a bit on this already. And it has three main causes. Obviously, a greater longevity. We live longer as people. There is a fall in fecundity. We have fewer children. And there is also a third factor that tends to be a bit invisible, that not all the people who are in between the two brackets, the elderly and the children, that are possibly active people in the labor market, are really so, because there are many people who are out of the labor market, mostly women. This rate of participation and the gender gap in the participation rate worldwide is a key indicator of that. So if we close the gender gaps, and I will go there in a minute on how to do so, we will also be facing one of the main causes of population aging, and one of the worst conditions we have today worldwide to face this trend that will unlikely go away. There are many things that we can do, and mostly they are related to two key issues. The first one is, how do we create the conditions for all the families, and when I say families, I say mostly women, who want to have more children, to be able to do so. In most of the development world, at least, there is a high concentration of poverty in households with children. This is the opposite of what we should do. We should creating the best conditions for people to have children. We are now creating sort of a tax for childbearing and child welcoming to this world. If we work on conditions to improve whatever resources families have to have those children, we might be able to at least delay a bit this process. Secondly, what happens when the children are already here? This is the main cause of women withdrawal from the labor market. Women tend to go outside of the labor market when they have to take care of their children, mostly, or other domestic responsibilities. If we have in place care policies that can help families equilibrate, balance household tasks together with labor market participation, we might be more able to increase this female participation, which should obviously go hand in hand with a greater co-responsibility between genders. This decrease in women's participation in domestic work, in care work, can only happen if we have the concrete policies in place, but also if we have a greater allotment of time from men to these tasks. So the two problems are sort of two faces of the same problem, of the same coin.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that again. And Tetsushi Sonobe, but this is clearly not just a European problem. Aging is global, and many Asian countries are facing this. There are some developed countries and economies like Japan or South Korea, but also different countries that have a shrinking working force, global force, and they're concerned that before they get the same level of well-being, their workforce will strengthen. You know, they say, for example, in China, we don't want to get old before we're going to get rich. So this is one of the, is this a fate, or is there anything that can be done?
Yeah, this is a huge problem. Thank you very much for raising that issue. Before that, I would like to say that I'm absolutely delighted to be a part of this wonderful event. Thank you very much, Bocconi University and ISPI, and also as chair of the Think 7 T7 Japan, which is official engagement, think tank engagement group of G7 Japan. I'm very happy to work with Italian think tank colleagues before and after I hand over the T7 chairmanship and secretariat to Italian colleagues.
You're very welcome. Okay.
Then, yes, so the population aging has two aspects. One is the people living longer. And then this itself causes lots of difficulty because increasing the social welfare programs and improvement and expansion of health care systems that will cause a kind of financial stress to developing countries. In addition, the population aging is usually often associated with declining birth rate, as you said, so shrinking labor population. So this is a huge problem. That the problem is, real problem is that the developing country government and the people do not know that, how serious it is. They tend to think, actually maybe three important things that they don't know, but they have to pay a lot of attention to. So I hope I can cover all these three. So first is that they don't know that the mindset can change drastically. So because developing country people tend to think that population aging problem would be a problem for maybe problem in developed countries, advanced economy countries, but it will not be a problem in our society because we live together with aged parents, and it's very natural, and then we can support old parents. But maybe Italian people know, but Japanese also know that that kind of social norm changed suddenly. Yes, actually, there is some data collected by the Japanese national, very big newspaper, asks the kind of opinion every year in the same format for 50 years, 60 years. And then previously, until middle of the 1980s, the vast majority of women and men in Japan said it's very natural, also responsibility for the young people to support elderly at home. We don't need government help. So government thought, we don't have to allocate lots of budget for the care. But people began thinking, although I have to say because this is social norm, but actually I don't think so. I'm not so happy to help my parents, especially my parents-in-law. Right? But still, it's social norm. So they continue to say, if they ask, I would support my parents-in-law. But some government changed the policy slightly, then people change kind of suddenly. The vast majority of the women say, we cannot support parents. So that kind of change takes place. So government or people may think in developing countries that our society is okay, but that's not true. So they should assume that people's attitude will be very different in the decade later or 2 decades later. So they have to start the preparation now. And then to prepare, they have to know what the situation of health. So elderly people, some have dementia, some have frail, right? So although the population aging is usually measured in terms of the percentage of population of age 65 and above, but health conditions are very different from country to country. So developing countries, 65-year-old person and the Italian 65-year-old person, maybe health condition may be very, very different. So the developing country people may think the percentage in our country is still low, but they may have suddenly the population aging problem. That's possibility. So they have to start. So and then that kind of measurement, so what percentage of elderly people have dementia, and then to what extent.
Sure.
That kind of measurement is very important, but it's not really good even in Japan. So in Japan, the estimates of that kind of magnitude of the people with dementia or frail, the measurement is very, very, extremely rough. So that must be improved. So, and this is, I think, the task for the academics and think tanks. The number 3, even if there are very good healthcare system and care systems generally, but elderly people may not be happy if they are helped by the migrants or someone who are not at all familiar with. So declining the birth rate is a huge problem. So to change that trend, the government and the society have to make extremely big effort to change the life-work balance. And then, in many, many developing countries in Asia, not only Africa, the child daycare system is very rare. So many people don't know what it is. And then other, social protection system. So those things must be changed. And also, men have to take maternity leave and other leave for, to help child care. Otherwise, the young couples do not want to, have babies, right? So this is a problem of culture and social norm. Very difficult for individuals to change. That's why government initiative is very important.
Absolutely. Very interesting to have the Asian perspective on this. Something also sounds familiar for the Italian trends in demographic. But let's move to the Middle East perspective with Neila bin Mimoun. Thanks again for joining us today. What's your perspective on these trends, but also on the role that families do have, and how is it the fertility challenge approached in the Middle East?
Sure. Thank you first for having me. Thank you for the question. And thank you for ISPI and the Bocconi University and OECD for organizing this forum. Looking at the past 50 years, fertility rate has dropped dramatically in the Middle East and North African region. It went from being one of the highest rates across the world, around 6.7 per woman in the 70s, to less than 3 children per woman now. While this trend is driven in some part by the introduction of family planning programs in some of the countries as early as the 60s, such as Egypt, and then later on in other North African countries, it's not really the key factor. So most of it is a shift in attitudes of both men and women, and moving more toward what a couple of researchers called
a high-quality family. And so they desire less children, and they want to invest more time and money and energy into their education and bringing them in a better environment. But also, a part of it is the change or structural change in the household or the family structure of the Middle Eastern and North African families. And so it went from an extended family living together in one household to what we call a nuclear unit family, with just the parents and 2 to 3 children. So with women going more into the labor market, you lose that support system to raise your children, the grandchildren, the grandparents basically do not live at the household. So you have to use your own resources, whether financially or time-wise, to care for your children. So you tend to desire to have less children. But also another contributing factor is that more women choose to finish their education. We have more women actually graduating from universities than men across many Middle Eastern and North African countries. And the labor force participation, although stagnantly lower than men, it's rising across the region. So with women preferring to finish their education and go into the labor market, there is more and more delayed marriage than we used to see before. But also part of it is because of economic factors. So in the region we have very high youth unemployment and what we call also under-employment. And we'll talk more about it later on. When young people finish their universities but do not find fitting jobs, so they're stuck into what we call a prolonged waithood, and they don't transition right away into marriage and family formation.
That's very interesting. That resounds something that happens in different areas. Now, Francesco Billari, let me ask you a question about Italy, because in Italy we do have a life expectancy around 82, if I'm right. We've got a fertility rate which is 1.24, and you know, the new government has established a secretary for fertility, but I mean, that's a show of intention, but how to go beyond that, and what kind of policies can change the situation in the middle term, at least?
Yeah, the demography is usually seen as something that is inexorable and exogenous and about the long run. But we need to look both at the long run and at the short run, as you mentioned before. So demography is, I like to say, both slow and predictable, and fast and malleable by policy. On the slow side, Italy has had low fertility for decades. It was the country with the lowest fertility in the world during the middle 90s. To change that, we need policies that are persistent, that look at the long run, and that are stable. And this is what has happened in countries where low fertility has not appeared, like France, or in countries where there's been a reversal, like Germany. So here, I think the current policies are going towards the right direction, but there is no one single policy. There needs to be a whole system to let families choose the number of children, especially if they want, in our case, a larger number of children. The connected issue is how to deal with population aging. So Italy is, after Japan, a champion of population aging. It's not disconnected to that, but this is something we're gonna have to deal in the long run, and to make sure we take the best opportunities out of this challenge. A third point on the slow side, on the long-term development, and then I'll go to the slow-term side, is differentials within Italy. We've already heard Commissioner Suiza mentioning different regions. Italy has many regions that are on the problematic side of demographic development, i.e. with both depopulation and a low share of graduates. Basically, the whole of central southern Italy is flagged as the most problematic area in Western Europe demographically. And it's been like that for decades. So we need to deal with diversity of demographic challenges within Italy, and Italy is not a single country for what concerns demographic development, also economic developments. We have both the richest regions in Western Europe and the poorest regions in Western Europe. So what to do in the short run? It's already been mentioned. We need a migration policy. Italy is a country that has to realize to be a destination country of migrants. We have to accept that and make a choice how to govern migration, also to keep Italians from going abroad. The second, how to do it in the short run, for what concerns labor shortages. We need to bring more women in the labor force. You mentioned the global level of labor force participation. Italy is 51% for women. It's the lowest in the European Union. We have to change that. It has the highest share of young people not in education, neither in education nor in employment. So this has to be the target for the short run. Migration, bringing more women, bringing young people back to the labor market.
Well, Setsushi Sanobe just introduced the fact that changing mindset is not that easy or that fast. You mentioned migration, for example. Do you think that how a country like Italy will, realize that things have changed? And it's very political, and there's a huge polarization in the spectrum.
I like to look at the example of Germany. Even a visionary like Helmut Kohl in the late 90s and the early 2000s declared, we are not a country of immigration. And I was a migrant, a qualified migrant to Germany during that time. I was always surprised to say, how come you Germans do not realize that Germany is a destination country? It has been like that for decades. It took a mindset change at the highest policy level. In particular, later it was highly realized by Chancellor Merkel, saying, we are a country of migration. We need migrants, but we need to think about migration and have integration policies. That's what we need in Italy.
I mean, this is not academic. This is about, the future of sustainability also from a welfare state perspective. And it will be absolutely crucial. Let me also move to Langu for another question, which is related to a different area, which is Latin America. LATAM is one of the younger, in general, areas. The number of over 16 is relatively limited towards the average that we already heard. But what's your idea of the future of this younger generation and how to create a more inclusive future of the economy in those areas for the youngest generations?
Well, thank you for the question. Indeed, Latin America is relatively a young continent, but it is aging very, very fast. Argentina, in the last 5 years, has aged what most of European countries took 25 years to age. So our aging curve is much more steep than in other regions. However, we do still have the demographic dividend and are able to, or could be able to, take advantage of that. So how to do so? How can we take advantage of this relatively young population to be better prepared to the aging that we know will come and that we know is coming fast? Well, the policies are very much in line with what has been discussed. The G20 has already set a target of reducing the gender gap in labor force participation of 25% by 2025. This is called 25 by 25. It was set in 2014 in Brisbane. However, since then, almost 10 years have gone by, and most of the countries aren't getting close to this target. In fact, the pandemic has widened the gender gaps in labor participation, mostly. Apologies. Therefore, it is crucial to concentrate on concrete policies that can have an impact in reducing these gaps. Obviously, most of the impact that these policies can have are transversely crossed by the cultural norms we have. We need to work on that. But there are policies that can concretely help in that direction. Maternity leave, for instance, it has been mentioned very, very quick recently. If we don't expand paternity or second caregiver leaves, we won't be able to reduce this gap, because from the very start, from the birth of a baby, we are saying to women, your job is to take care of this baby. And we're saying to men, your job is to take care of your job. So we need to change those mindsets that will have an effect on how care is distributed throughout the life cycle. There are other policies that can help. The creation of care services, the transfer, concrete transfer, money transfers to families with children. There are several other initiatives that can be taken place in order to reduce these gender gaps. But we also need to get ready our pension systems to this aging of the population that we know is coming. In most of Latin American countries, we have quite a broad coverage of our pension systems. Obviously, there are different scenarios and certain heterogeneities, but overall, the greater problem is that we tend to liaise the access to the pension system to the labor status. And in a region with growing informality, such as most of the emerging countries, this is a problem. We don't want to limit the access to social protection in elderly age to the formality in the participation in the labor force, because that will leave most of the population out of what we need to cover. So we need to rethink our pension regime to have a more universal coverage, while not obviously disregarding the amount of money that we are giving together with other more parametric changes that we need to implement, such as retiring age.
Yeah, that's a radical challenge, not just in Latin America, but everywhere. And talking about that, Tetsushi Sonobe, you at the Asian Development Bank Institute, you just recently studied generation transition. And what did you learn by this study? And in addition, does digitization can help in this kind of transition? How do you see also the role of the elderly in the future? We have to change our mindset. I recently spoke with the geriatrician, Professor Bernabe, who cured also Pope Francis, and he said, we should treat these elderly people like the oil, like a resource, because they can give back to society a lot, but we treat them like, they are off, and there's nothing we can, or they can give, or we can take out of them.
Thank you very much. So the digital technology will help a lot, because population aging means a larger portion of the working population will be taken to the care work, right? So the remaining people will have to increase their productivity a lot to support elderly people, ever-increasing elderly people, and ever-increasing care workers. So the digital technology and whatever new technology must be mobilized and used, effectively. And also, digital technology can help the elderly people themselves, because healthcare, they can always measure the many things.
Yeah, sure.
That's one. And then also they can, even if they stay on bed for many hours in a day, they can still earn some income and pay tax, and that will give a great joy of contributing to society, to the elderly people. right? And yes, my mother is 94-year-old, still paying tax. Yes. So that's earning money will be a great source of motivation and happiness. Yes. And also many people have to become care workers. So their working condition and their productivity, everything must be improved. Right. So then again, the digital technology will play a very important role.
All right, and best wishes for your mom, but there's plenty of people, Henry Kissinger is still commenting the geopolitical situation, he's 100. And we went on the air with the Berkshire Hathaway annual general meeting, and Warren Buffett, he's 92, and his right hand, Charlie Munger, he's 99. And they answered 7 hours of questions from shareholders. And this is, what the elderly people can do. And my last question to Ben Mimoun is about the access into formal work also for women, which is crucial to plan for a family, for the future. What can Middle East government do to create a more easy access or guaranteed access to these kind of works?
I think, as I mentioned before, we have high unemployment among youth, but especially among women. The differences between female and male unemployment rates reaches 20 percentile points for countries such as Algeria and Jordan, and as high as 30 for Palestine and Iraq. So the difference is quite drastic here, but we also have high informal unemployment as share of total employment in several countries, reaching around 50% in Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia, and above 60% in countries such as Syria, Palestine, Iraq, and Morocco. So the key issue here toward this under-unemployment and high unemployment rates is there is a skill gap between what the universities or formal educational system are providing young graduates with and what the market is actually demanding. So it's an issue that other speakers have mentioned before. So it's not quite unique to the region. There is always this the government or the ministers of education do not consult the private sector on what they need, so they don't offer what's actually demanded by the labor market. But also, as Gal has mentioned, we need to introduce more gender-friendly regulations, such as providing, actually, in a lot of the regional countries, longer maternity leave, which is quite low by any Western standard, but also flexible work. And if the COVID pandemic has showed us something, is that flexibility and remote work is possible when there is a will. So we need to provide more flexibility in the work environment. Also working on improving the business environment and encouraging entrepreneurship, because that can be a source for more jobs and for youth and women. And also working on formalization, a lot of formalization efforts, and encouraging expansion of formal enterprises by providing flexible fiscal, regulatory, and legal frameworks.
All right, fantastic. Many of these solutions are valuable everywhere, not just in the Middle East. So thanks again to Neila bin Mimoun, Tetsushi Sonobe, Gala Diaz-Langu, and Francesco Billari, Professor Billari. Thanks, everyone of our panelists, for the terrific discussion. And I think we're done for the day. The Future Leaders Global Policy Forum will go on tomorrow, starting again at 2 p.m. here in the same place. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Chairman. Gas prices soaring to the highest average ever recorded.
Highest inflation in 40 years.